They say the wisest woman never seeks revenge. She just sits still, builds her empire, and lets time do the rest. But tonight, at Chicago's most extravagant reunion party, Seraphina Vale walks into the room where, 10 years ago, people called her the unmemorable one. Beside her is the man even the government fears. And the man who completely shattered her sits motionless in the corner, looking at all he has lost. This isn't about revenge. This is the story of a woman learning to look herself in the eye. And then, no one can stop her anymore. Follow my channel to the end. Hit, like, if you're with Seraphina, and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come. The cereal was stale. Seraphina noticed that first, not the divorce papers spread across the marble countertop, not the rain hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows 40 stories above Manhattan, not the fact that it was 2 in the morning and she was standing barefoot on cold Italian tile in a kitchen that cost more than everything she'd ever owned before the age of 32. She noticed that the cereal was stale and that she didn't care enough to put the box down. She ate another handful anyway. The papers rustled softly when a draft moved through the apartment. She'd left a window cracked somewhere. The city noise filtered up faintly. Horns, rain, the ambient roar of a place that never bothered to be quiet. And Seraphina stood very still in the middle of it all and thought about absolutely nothing. That was new. 3 months ago, standing in this same kitchen, thinking about nothing was impossible. 3 months ago, every room in this apartment breathed Damien's presence. The particular way he left cabinet doors open an inch, the brand of bourbon he kept on the second shelf, the faint cedar smell of his coats hanging by the door. 3 months ago, she would have been doing what she'd spent 7 years doing inside this marriage, trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. Now there was just the rain and the stale cereal and the papers that turned her from wife to former wife with a notary's stamp. She should have felt something. She felt the cold of the tile through her socks instead. She felt the box edge digging into her palm. She stood there and ate cereal in the dark like a person who'd simply run out of dramatic responses to dramatic things. And after a while, she set the box down and looked at the papers properly for the first time. Damien Cross. Petitioner. Seraphina Marie Vale. Respondent. She'd never changed her last name. He'd taken that as a statement eventually. The first 2 years, he'd laughed it off. You and that independence, Sarah, God. And by year 4, it had become evidence, something he pulled out during fights the way you pull out a hidden ace. You never really committed. You were never fully here. You kept one foot out the door, as though her name was the problem, as though the problem had ever been hers. Seraphina set the papers down neatly, squaring the edges against the marble, and went to bed. She slept 8 hours straight for the first time in 4 years. She'd grown up in a small city in Ohio that prided itself on things that didn't matter. High school football records, the particular quality of its county fair, a general sense that people from here were sensible and people from elsewhere were suspect. Her parents had been sensible people. Her father fixed HVAC systems, and her mother worked the front desk at an insurance office, and they both loved Seraphina in the uncomplicated way of people who didn't fully understand what they'd produced. She was 9 when she taught herself algebra from a library book because the class moved too slowly. She was 11 when she started reading financial news the way other kids read comics. She was 14 when she presented her father with a detailed analysis of why his business should expand into commercial contracts rather than residential, complete with projected revenue figures and a breakdown of startup costs. And her father had looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she would spend years trying to decode. Something between pride and unease, like a man who discovered his houseplant had roots that went all the way down to bedrock. "You're something, Sarah," he'd said. He meant it kindly. It didn't feel kind. The problem was that being something, in the particular landscape she grew up in, was not always an advantage. Brilliant girls in sensible towns learned early that the smart play was to make their intelligence comfortable for everyone around them. Soften it. Redirect it. Let boys have the right answers in class, and then quietly ace every exam in private. Learn to ask questions you already knew the solutions to so that other people felt useful. Seraphina had been a fast learner. By the time she reached university on a full academic scholarship, the kind that makes the local paper, the kind her mother cut out and kept in a frame, she had spent 6 years practicing smallness so effectively that she'd nearly forgotten she was doing it, It had become load-bearing, structural. The way she moved through rooms, the particular angle she held her shoulders, the habit of slightly underplaying her own analysis in conversations so the other person could feel like they'd gotten there first. College was better and worse simultaneously. Better because the people were sharper, and she had to work less hard to dumb herself down to the room's level. Worse because the stakes were higher, and the cruelty came dressed in more sophisticated clothes. Her roommate freshman year was a girl named Brittany, who found Seraphina's thrift store wardrobe quietly hilarious. Not cruel hilarious, just casually, unconsciously hilarious, the way you find someone's regional accent vaguely amusing without meaning any harm by it. She'd recommend stores to Seraphina with a particular patient generosity that managed to communicate both goodwill and condescension in perfect measure. "This place has a sale right now. I think it'd be in your budget." Seraphina had nodded and smiled and bought one blouse from the sale rack just to have something to report back, and spent the money she'd saved on 3 more finance textbooks. She graduated top of her class with a double major in finance and economics and walked into her first job at Garrison and Holt Capital Management, carrying a laptop she'd bought refurbished and a level of analytical capability that should have made her untouchable. It did not make her untouchable. What it made her was useful in ways that left no fingerprints. The ideas that came out of late nights she worked alone became presentations her manager delivered to partners. The risk assessments she built from scratch came back to her with her superior's name on the header. She watched men 3 years younger get promoted around her and told herself it was temporary. It was the learning curve. It was how these things worked before they worked in your favor. She told herself that for 4 years. Then she met Damien Cross at a networking event, and everything else became briefly irrelevant. He was good-looking in a calculated way, the kind of man who understood exactly how he came across and managed that impression with practiced ease. Dark hair, a jaw that photographed well, suits that fit him like he'd been born wearing them. He worked in investment banking and had the particular confidence of a man who'd been told since childhood that he was exceptional and had never seriously encountered evidence to the contrary. He'd walked up to her at the event, a quarterly finance mixer in a hotel ballroom, the kind of thing you attended because you were supposed to and left as soon as it was polite, and said something genuinely funny about the past appetizers, and Seraphina had laughed a real laugh, surprised by it. That was how it started. That laugh. He'd ask questions and actually listen to her answers. He'd push back on one of her points about emerging market volatility with an argument that was technically wrong, but showed he'd actually processed what she'd said. When she dismantled his counterargument with 3 sentences, he'd grinned like someone who found being corrected enjoyable. And for a woman who'd spent years making herself smaller so men could feel taller, that grin was practically seismic. They dated for a year. He was attentive and occasionally brilliant and always charming, and in those early months there were real moments. Mornings in his apartment when they both had coffee and the newspaper, and it felt like something true. Real conversations about things that mattered. A weekend in Vermont where they drove through autumn hills and talked until 2 in the morning, and she'd thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. She married him because she loved him. She also married him because she was 28, and the particular brand of loneliness she carried had started to feel permanent, and Damien had made her feel seen in a way that, looking back, she would understand was really just the absence of being actively ignored. The shift was gradual, barely perceptible at first, the way a foundation settles. No single visible crack, just a slow accumulation of small adjustments and subtle recalibrations, until one day you realize the whole structure is off-level. The first year of marriage was fine. The second year, Seraphina got promoted to senior analyst and started leading a team and coming home later and thinking about work in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. And something in Damien's face changed around the edges when she talked about it. Not overtly, not in any way she could point to directly, just a slight shift of attention, a marginal decrease in the quality of his listening, the way a person's eyes move to their phone a half second before they know they're going to. By year 3, she had built enough of a track record that headhunters were calling. One offered her a position at a mid-size investment firm that was hemorrhaging money for reasons she could diagnose from the outside in about 40 minutes. The position came with a title and a compensation package that made her mouth go dry, and she'd come home excited for the first time in months, sat down across from Damien at dinner and laid it all out. He'd listened with his hands folded on the table and his face arranged in an expression of careful consideration, and then said, "That firm's not stable, Sarah. I don't want you walking into something that puts you in a bad position." She'd believed him. She'd turned it down. 6 months later, the firm turned around under new leadership and was acquired at 3 times its previous valuation. She didn't bring it up. Neither did he. By year 4, the compliments had stopped, and she hadn't noticed the exact moment they'd stopped, which was the worst part. You notice their absence the way you notice a sound that's been running in the background for years, not when it stops, but days later, in the new quiet, when you realize you can no longer remember what it sounded like. He stopped touching her casually. The small physical grammar of a working marriage, a hand at the small of her back passing through a doorway, the automatic reach across the console in the car, went silent. They were civil and coordinated and shared a bed and a kitchen and a life that looked entirely functional from the outside and increasingly resembled a merger that had lost its strategic rationale from the inside. The night she came home at 11 after closing the biggest deal of her career, a restructuring play that had taken 9 months and left her absolutely spent and also more alive than she'd felt in years, Damien was asleep. She'd stood in the doorway of their bedroom and realized she hadn't planned on telling him about it. The reflex had dissolved. She'd spent the cab ride home thinking about next steps and never once thought, "I can't wait to tell Damien." She turned off the light and went to work at the kitchen table until 3. Emma's sound. The words that ended it came on a Tuesday in March, with no particular lead-up. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table reviewing a proposal when he'd come in from a dinner out. Colleagues, he'd said, though she'd stopped cataloging the details of his schedule around the time he'd stopped asking about hers, and poured himself a drink and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "You were easier to love when you needed me," he said. He said it the way you say something you've been thinking for a long time and have finally given up not saying. Tired and flat, not cruel exactly, more like a diagnosis delivered by someone who'd run out of bedside manner. Seraphina looked up from her papers. She didn't say anything, not because she couldn't find words, but because something inside her went very quiet all at once, the way a room goes quiet when a sound stops that you didn't realize was sound. Damien drank his bourbon and set the glass down and went to bed. She stayed at the table for another 2 hours. Not working. Just sitting in the particular silence of having finally heard the truth spoken out loud and recognizing, with a clarity that was almost cold, that she had known it for years. He didn't love her. He had loved the version of her that fit him like a tool fits a hand, useful, accommodating, shaped to his grip. As she had grown, as she'd taken up more space professionally and intellectually, and finally, carefully, personally, he had experienced her expansion as a kind of theft, as if her becoming more was mathematically equivalent to him becoming less. She filed for divorce 3 weeks later. She found a studio apartment in a different borough. She took her laptop, her books, her professional files, a coffee maker, and her name. She left the kitchen with the marble countertops worth more than her first apartment. She left the art they'd picked out together, and the furniture, and the photographs. She left 7 years of a life built around someone who had ultimately needed her small. She left in a cab at 7 in the morning and did not cry. Not because she wasn't sad, because something below the sadness had shifted weight, settled into a new position, gone still and dense and quiet, and she understood instinctively that whatever came next was going to require everything she had. She couldn't afford to use any of it on grief. Mas. The studio was 16 blocks from her office and smelled like the previous tenant's cleaning products, and had a radiator that knocked every 40 minutes like something trapped inside the wall trying to get out. Seraphina stood in the middle of it at 7:30 in the morning with one bag and her laptop case and looked at 4 walls that belonged to no one and thought, good. Good because it was hers. Good because nothing in this space carried someone else's weight. Good because the radiator knocked and the floors were scratched and there was a water stain on the ceiling shaped vaguely like a running dog. And none of it was Damien's, and none of it was what people expected of her. And all of it, every square foot of it, was a starting point. She bought a bed frame and a desk that week. She set up her workstation before she unpacked her clothes. She made a list on a legal pad, the old kind, yellow, from a corner drugstore. And the list was not a feelings list or a processing list or any of the lists people suggest you make when your marriage has just ended. The list was a business plan, not a hobby, not a side project, not a careful measured step into slightly better employment. A business. She had spent the last 4 years watching a mid-size investment firm execute strategies she could have written in her sleep, and she had spent 7 years watching men with half her capability take twice her credit, and she had spent a significant portion of her adult life believing that being brilliant was only acceptable if she kept it in proportion to what the room could tolerate. She was done keeping it proportionate. The list grew for 3 nights straight. By the end of it, she had a target sector: luxury real estate and hospitality assets in distress, a proposed fund structure, a list of potential seed investors she'd cultivated over 4 years of doing excellent work that other people had put their names on, and a caffeine dependency that was frankly already there before any of this. She'd called the first investor at 6:15 on a Thursday morning because she knew he ran in Riverside Park before 7 and would pick up. "Marcus," she said when he answered, slightly winded, "I need 40 minutes of your time and a commitment not to tell anyone what I'm about to tell you until I'm ready. Can you do that?" A short pause. "Seraphina Vale calling me before 7. Yeah, I can do that." "Good," she said. "I'm starting a company." She heard him slow down. "What kind of company?" "The kind I should have started 3 years ago." Another pause, longer. Then, "Meet me at the coffee place on Lex at 8. She was already there at 7:40. She had the terms written on a legal pad and a backup draft on her laptop and a level of focus she hadn't felt since the night her marriage had effectively ended in a kitchen at 2 in the morning with a box of cereal and a revelation. She told Marcus her thesis in 22 minutes. He asked 6 questions, 3 of which were excellent, and 3 of which told her he didn't fully understand the sector yet. She answered all 6 and watched his face carefully and saw the moment the numbers resolved into something he recognized as opportunity. "You'd need to build a team," he said. "I have 3 names already. All of them are better than what they're currently being paid for." "What about your non-compete?" "I reviewed it last year. It covers my current client list, not a new market segment." He sat back and drank his coffee and looked at her like he was revising something. "How much are you looking for to start?" She told him. He winced slightly, which was expected, and then he nodded, which was what mattered. "I'll need to think about it," he said. "You have until Friday," she said. "I have 2 other conversations scheduled." She didn't yet, but she would. He called her Thursday afternoon, and that was how Vale Meridian Holdings began. In a coffee shop on Lexington Avenue on a gray October morning, with a legal pad and borrowed credibility, and a woman who had finally, completely, irrevocably run out of patience with being underestimated. The first 2 years were the kind of difficult that doesn't make for good stories. No single dramatic moment, no pivotal breakthrough, just sustained, grinding, 100-hour-week difficult. The kind of difficult where you cancel plans you never made and forget to eat and wake up at 3 in the morning running numbers in your head, and the only thing keeping you functional is the specific momentum of forward motion, the biochemical fact that moving is easier than stopping. She hired 4 people from her old firm, carefully, quietly, one at a time over 6 months, each of them someone she'd watched produce excellent work under someone else's name. She set them up in a borrowed office in Tribeca that belonged to a law firm friend who used it only 4 days a week. She made deals she couldn't quite afford and then made them work through a combination of analysis, nerve, and a willingness to sit across the table from difficult people without flinching. The first acquisition was a boutique hotel in the meatpacking district that had been hemorrhaging money for 3 years and whose owners were exhausted and ready to be done. Seraphina had identified it from public filings 8 months before she had the capital to move on it. She bought it at a number that made her investors nervous and then spent 18 months executing a repositioning strategy she'd built from first principles. And when it reopened under new branding, it sold out its first 60 days and ran a profile in a hospitality trade publication that mentioned Vale Meridian Holdings 3 times in 4 paragraphs. Then came the Monaco acquisition. Then Seoul. Then a resort portfolio in the Maldives that she'd gotten access to through a connection she'd cultivated for 2 years before she'd needed to use it. By the time she was 36, people in the industry had stopped describing Vale Meridian Holdings as promising and started describing it as formidable. The financial press found her eventually, which she'd anticipated and prepared for. The profile in Meridian Business Review ran under the headline, "The Ghost Architect of Modern Luxury," a phrase the writer had coined and that stuck immediately, which Seraphina found slightly irritating because she hadn't set out to be a ghost, anything but recognize that you don't always get to choose your own mythology. She'd given the interview in her office, which was a proper office now, glass-walled, 40 stories up, with a Manhattan view she'd earned in the most literal possible sense. The journalist had asked her the question journalists always asked women who'd built something from nothing. What drove you? Seraphina had considered the honest answer, which was complicated, and given a more compressed version. I got tired of building things for rooms I'd never get to stand in, she said. The journalist wrote it down. It ran as the pull quote. It was true, as far as it went. She was in Singapore at a private investment summit, the kind with no public attendee list and security that discouraged photography, when she saw Lucian Moretti across a room for the first time. She'd known the name before she knew the face. Everyone in certain circles knew the name. International security consultant was the official designation, and in the legitimate business world, it held enough ambiguity that people used it and moved on. In less official circles, the name carried different weight, the weight of shipping routes and private intelligence networks, and a particular brand of order enforced by people who didn't need titles because the absence of opposition made titles redundant. Interpol had 3 open files on Lucian Moretti. None of them had produced a conviction. The most recent one had been closed after 2 key witnesses independently declined to continue cooperating, both of them healthy and unharmed, which was in some ways more frightening than the alternative. Seraphina knew all of this. She'd done her research the way she did all her research, thoroughly, without sentiment, with a clear-eyed assessment of risk that included the possibility of proximity. What she hadn't prepared for was the way he looked at her. He was across the room when she first noticed him, tall, still, silver-eyed, wearing a dark suit with the particular ease of a man for whom clothes were simply the least interesting thing about him. He was being spoken to by 2 men who both wanted something from him. She could read it in their body language, the slight forward lean, the cultivated deference. He was listening with half his attention, and she couldn't tell where the other half was until his eyes moved across the room and found her. He didn't look away. That was the unusual part. Most men in rooms like this glanced and categorized and moved on, the social professional assessment completing in under a second. Lucian Moretti looked at her and kept looking, not with anything overt or aggressive, just with the undivided quality of a man who had decided something and was comfortable with having decided it. Seraphina held eye contact for exactly the right amount of time and then turned back to her conversation. 40 minutes later, he appeared at her elbow. "You were the only person in this room," he said, by way of introduction, "who didn't look at me like you either wanted something or were afraid of me." His voice was low, European-edged, unhurried. Seraphina turned to look at him directly. Up close, the silver eyes were more complicated, gray deepening toward something darker at the edge of the iris, the kind of eyes that had seen things and processed them without flinching. "Should I be afraid of you?" she asked. "Most people are." "Most people," she said, "haven't built a company from a legal pad in a borrowed office. It recalibrates your threshold." Something shifted in his expression, very slight, like a mechanism moving a fraction of an inch in a piece of precision equipment. "Lucian Moretti," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Seraphina Vale." "I know who you are," he said back. And that was how it started. Not with fear, not with want. With 2 people in a room who'd spent their respective careers being the most dangerous thing present, looking at each other and recognizing something that didn't require performance. She didn't know yet what it would become. She didn't know about the midnight dinners in Seoul overlooking the Han River, the armored convoys through rain-slicked Italian streets, the night in Monaco when she'd stood on a balcony above the coast and understood for the first time in her adult life that being fully seen didn't have to feel like exposure. She didn't know yet about Celeste, or about the life they'd build on a foundation of mutual recognition so complete it felt almost frightening in its steadiness. She knew only that the man standing in front of her was looking at her the way no one had looked at her since she'd made the mistake of marrying someone who needed her smaller, and that this time she had no intention of making herself smaller for anyone. Across the summit room, two of Lucien's men had clocked the conversation and exchanged a glance, not alarmed, just noting. Their principal had never introduced himself to someone unprompted at an event like this. In 4 years of working for him, neither of them had seen him choose someone. He had chosen. Seraphina Vale didn't know that yet either. But somewhere in the back of her mind, in the same part that had known 4 years before she admitted it that her marriage was ending, in the same part that had recognized the value of a distressed hotel in the meatpacking district before anyone else thought to look, something clicked quietly into place like a combination landing right. She held out her hand. "Buy me a drink," she said, "and tell me one true thing about yourself." Lucien's mouth curved. Not a smile exactly. Something with more edges than a smile. Something earned rather than offered. "That's a dangerous request," he said. "I know," she said. He shook her hand. His grip was firm and brief and left no question about who he was. "One drink," he said. "One true thing." They walked toward the bar at the far end of the room, and neither of them looked back. And whatever had been set into motion in that moment would not stop moving for a very long time, which was exactly what neither of them had expected. And both of them, in some deep wordless place, had been waiting for without knowing it. The summit would last 3 more days. By the end of the first evening, she would know 3 true things about him. By the end of the summit, she would know enough to understand that she had met someone she would not be able to categorize cleanly, and that this was not a problem. It was a beginning. And somewhere in a different city, in a corner office where he spent most of his energy managing the quiet collapse of a career that had never lived up to its own mythology, Damien Cross sat across from a performance review he wasn't going to enjoy and thought briefly about his ex-wife and then thought about something else. He had no idea what was coming. Nobody who knows only a person's past ever does. The drink lasted 4 hours. That was the first thing that surprised her. Not the content of the conversation, not the man himself, but the simple fact of time moving differently than it usually did when she was working, which was the only mode she'd operated in for the better part of 5 years. Normally, she was clock-aware in the way of someone who'd learned that time was the one resource that couldn't be recapitalized. She tracked it automatically, the way a pilot tracks altitude, not with anxiety, just with constant peripheral awareness. Sitting across from Lucien Moretti at a bar in Singapore at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, she looked up at some point and it was 1 in the morning and she hadn't noticed the distance between those 2 facts. He'd told her one true thing, as requested. He'd said, "I've never trusted a room I didn't control the exits of until tonight." She'd sat with that for a moment. Is that a compliment or a threat assessment? Both, he'd said. And then he'd asked her something no one had asked her in years. Not what she'd built, not what her strategy was, not what her next move looked like. He'd asked her what she was afraid of, not in a soft way, not with the practiced gentleness of a therapist or the fishing for intimacy quality of a man trying to accelerate emotional access. He'd asked it the way you ask something you actually want the answer to, leaning forward slightly with those gray eyes fixed on her face. And she'd had the disorienting experience of realizing she was being read by someone who was as good at it as she was. She'd told him the truth. Becoming ordinary. He'd nodded like that was the right answer, not the expected answer, the right one. Most people are afraid of failure, he said. Failure is recoverable, she said. Ordinary is a choice you make so slowly you don't notice you're making it. He'd looked at her for a long moment after that. Then he'd signaled for another drink and changed the subject to the summit's agenda, and they hadn't circled back to anything personal for another hour. And the shift had felt less like retreat and more like 2 people who understood that the most important things didn't need to be pressed. By the time she went back to her hotel, she knew 3 true things about him. She knew he was from Turin originally, that he'd left at 17, and that he hadn't been back. She knew that the silver in his hair had started at 30. Genetics or stress, she'd asked, and he'd said both without inflection. And she knew that he kept 1 ring on his right hand, a plain dark band she hadn't asked about, and that he'd registered her not asking. She didn't know yet whether she was going to see him again after the summit. She found out the next morning when her assistant called to confirm her afternoon meeting and mentioned that her 4 o'clock had requested a schedule change to a private dinner instead. The requester's office cited a preference for a less formal environment, her assistant said, slightly puzzled. Should I confirm? Who's the requester's office? Seraphina asked, though she already knew. Her assistant told her. Confirm it, she said, and upgrade my hotel dinner reservation to their private dining room. She heard her assistant recalibrate. You want a host? I always want a host, she said. That's not new information. That's him. The 3 days of the summit established a pattern that would persist for the next 8 months across 6 cities. Seraphina controlled the environment, Lucien controlled the tempo, and neither of them ceded the other thing. They were both too experienced at reading rooms and too fundamentally uninterested in performance for the usual early relationship negotiations. The strategic vulnerability, the careful management of interest levels, the calibrated revelation of self. Those were tools for people who needed leverage. Both of them already had leverage. What they didn't have, and recognized immediately in each other, was someone who didn't require managing. It was clarifying in a way that was almost violent. After Singapore came Zurich, where they spent 36 hours in parallel, Seraphina running due diligence on a potential acquisition, Lucien doing whatever Lucien did in closed rooms with men whose names didn't appear on public guest lists. They met for dinner on the second night at a restaurant above the lake, where the maitre d' addressed Lucien with the particular careful deference of a man who wanted to convey both welcome and ignorance simultaneously. They talked about the acquisition she was looking at. She'd told him enough to be interesting, not enough to be indiscreet. And he'd asked 2 questions that were better than the questions her own analysts had asked. And she'd made a note about one of them later in her hotel room with a feeling she recognized as respect. After Zurich came Seoul, where she had a hotel project already in progress, and where Lucien seemed to have business that he described only in the broadest architectural terms, which she understood was not evasion, but simple professional discretion, the same discretion she applied to her own operations. They had dinner above the Han River on a night when the city was lit up in layers below them, and she'd looked out at it and felt briefly the full size of what she'd built. Not with pride exactly, more with a kind of vertiginous clarity, the way you sometimes feel at altitude. You're calculating something, he said. She turned back to him. I'm always calculating something. No, he said. That's your thinking face. This is different. This is your feeling something while thinking face. She looked at him steadily. You've been studying my face. Yes, he said, without apology or deflection. She picked up her glass. What did you conclude? That you have about 4 expressions in your professional register, and twice that in private, and you're very good at making people believe the private ones don't exist. The table was quiet for a moment. That's accurate, she said. I know, he said. I'm good at reading people. So am I, she said. I know that too, he said. It's why I find this interesting. They looked at each other across the table above the Han River with the city blazing below and the particular quality of 2 people who've run out of the usual pretense and are deciding whether what's left is manageable. She decided it was. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, once, briefly, and then took it back and picked up her menu. What's good here? She asked. He smiled, the full version, the one with edges. Everything, he said. They were together properly by the time she closed the Seoul hotel deal, which took another 4 months and required 3 renegotiations and 1 midnight call to her legal team that she made from the back of one of Lucien's armored cars, because her own driver had developed a timing problem and he'd offered without making a production of it. She'd sat in the back seat in the dark working the phone while his security lead drove, and Lucien read something on his own device beside her, perfectly comfortable with the fact that she was not paying attention to him, which was itself a kind of luxury she hadn't previously experienced in a relationship. She'd closed the deal at 1:15 in the morning Korean time. When she hung up, she sat back against the seat and exhaled once, hard. Done? He asked without looking up. Done? She said. He put his device down and looked at her properly. What do you need? Not congratulations, not I knew you'd do it, not any of the reflex responses she'd been receiving from professional contacts all evening. He'd asked what she needed, which was the correct question because closing something that hard after that long left a specific kind of emptiness that people who hadn't done it didn't understand. Food, she said. Something bad for me. And about 40 minutes where no one needs anything. I know a place, he said. The place was a 24-hour pojang matcha that he clearly knew well because the woman running it looked at him and didn't blink, which told Seraphina everything about the kind of regular he was. The kind who showed up without entourage, without performance, just wanting what he wanted in a place that wouldn't make a thing of it. They ate at a plastic table under orange light, with the city quiet around them, and nobody needed anything for exactly 43 minutes. She moved her offices to a larger space the following quarter. She hired 8 more people. She began preliminary work on a Monaco acquisition that would turn out to be the largest deal in Vale Meridian's history to that point. She also, quietly and with the specific care she applied to high-value decisions, accepted that what was happening with Lucien Moretti was not a manageable temporary thing. It was the other kind. She had one conversation with herself about the risk profile. 1. It took about 20 minutes on a flight between New York and London, sitting with a coffee she'd stopped tasting, looking out the window at the black Atlantic below. She laid out the variables the way she'd lay out any complex investment thesis. The genuine uncertainties, the known risks, the information she had versus the information she didn't, the scenarios in which this ended badly and their probability weights. She concluded that the risk was real, significant, and not the kind that could be fully hedged. She also concluded that she was going to proceed anyway, because the alternative was choosing safety over something that had not felt optional since a bar in Singapore at 1 in the morning. She'd made peace with the unhedgeable risk once before in her life, when she'd left a stable career to start a company from a legal pad. That had worked out. She closed her laptop and slept for 4 hours and landed in London ready to work. The proposal, such as it was, because Lucien was not a traditional proposal kind of man, and she would not have wanted him to be, happened on a Sunday morning in his apartment in New York, which he kept with the specific ordered sparseness of a man who spent very little time in any one place and had stopped collecting things that needed to be maintained in his absence. She'd been there a dozen times by then. She knew where he kept the good coffee and which drawer had the cables she needed for her laptop, and the precise location of the 2 weapons she'd identified in the apartment, which she'd never mentioned, and neither had he. She was sitting at his kitchen table with her laptop open and coffee going cold beside her when he came in from a call he'd been on in the other room, and he looked at her for a moment in the particular morning light with that specific expression she'd cataloged by then, the one that was unguarded in a way she was fairly certain nobody else was permitted to see, and he said simply, "I want to marry you." Not a question, a declaration. She appreciated that. She looked up from her screen. "Okay," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Okay?" Was there supposed to be more deliberation? Most people would want more deliberation. "I'm not most people," she said. "You know that." He sat down across from her. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about this since Seoul," she said. "I did my analysis. I made my decision. I was waiting to see if you'd get there." Something moved in his expression. "How long were you prepared to wait?" She considered it. "Another 6 months. After that, I would have brought it up myself." He laughed. A real one. The kind that didn't happen in professional settings. The kind she'd first heard in Zurich and that had lodged somewhere below her sternum like a piece of useful hardware. "Of course you would have," he said. "Time is a resource," she said. They married 4 months later in a small ceremony in Tuscany. 12 people total, no press, flowers she'd chosen herself because she had opinions about flowers. And it was the only event in Seraphina's adult life she hadn't run a stakeholder analysis on beforehand. And it was also the only event in her adult life that went exactly as it should have from beginning to end without requiring a single mid-course correction. Celeste was born the following spring. 6 pounds, 11 ounces. Black hair and gray eyes from her father, and a jaw set even in infancy that made the neonatologist laugh and say she already looked like she was running the room. Seraphina, lying in a hospital bed at 4 in the morning with a level of exhaustion she had no professional analog for, looked at her daughter and thought, "This one is going to be impossible, and I'm going to love every second of it." She was correct on both counts. None of this reached Damien Cross directly, which was, in its own way, a kind of statement. He'd heard things, the way you hear things in professional circles that overlap at the edges. Vale Meridian's name in financial press, the Monaco deal, the growing architectural scope of what she was building. He'd processed it with the selective attention of a man who needed to believe a specific narrative and was willing to curate his information intake to support it. She'd done well for herself. Good for her. It was separate from him. It didn't reflect on anything. He'd remarried at 39 to a woman named Claire, who was lovely and uncomplicated and who found him impressive in the way he'd always needed to be found impressive. And for a while, this had been enough. The apartment was nice. The social life was functional. His career had plateaued in a way he described as strategic consolidation, and other people were beginning to describe more quietly as stagnation. The thing about needing to feel superior in order to feel whole is that it requires a constant external supply of the right kind of comparison. You need people around you who reflect your version of yourself back in a flattering register. When those people disappear, when they grow or move on, or simply become too large for the frame you'd put them in, the whole apparatus of your self-concept starts rattling in a way that's difficult to quiet. Damien had been rattling for a while. He managed it. He was good at managing it. He'd had a lot of practice. The Alumni Gala invitation arrived in February. The Blackthorn Academy Alumni Association, Annual Gala, Imperial Crescent Hotel, Chicago. Black tie. He'd almost skipped it. These things were always a mixed experience, the layered social economics of who'd done what since graduation. But Claire had wanted to go, had a friend attending, had bought a dress already, and so he'd confirmed and made travel arrangements and told himself it would be fine. He had no particular reason to think it wouldn't be. The Imperial Crescent Hotel in Chicago was the kind of building that made a point of itself. 40 years old, renovated twice in the last decade, limestone facade in a lobby with ceilings that made sound travel strangely. Conversations absorbed and amplified simultaneously, so you were always slightly uncertain whether you were being heard. The gala occupied the main ballroom on the second floor. Chandeliers, live jazz, round tables with centerpieces that cost more than a week's groceries, the specific low roar of several hundred people performing their best versions of themselves in one room. Damien arrived at 7:30 with Claire on his arm and a drink in hand by 7:34, which was his usual pace at these things. He knew some people, former classmates in finance and law, and one in architecture who'd done something significant with sustainable commercial buildings and wouldn't stop talking about it. He circulated with the practiced ease of a man who'd been good at rooms before he'd stopped being good at much else. And for the first 90 minutes, things were entirely manageable. Then a man he'd known loosely in college, a corporate attorney named Frank, who had the particular energy of someone who'd had 2 drinks and encountered genuinely interesting news, found him near the bar and leaned in with that specific expression. "Did you see who's on the guest list?" Frank said. Damien looked at him. "I haven't looked at the guest list." "Seraphina Vale," Frank said. "Your ex, right? Vale Meridian Holdings? She owns half the luxury hotel sector at this point." Something shifted in Damien's chest. Small, managed immediately. "We were married, yes," he said. "Long time ago." "She married Lucien Moretti," Frank said, with the tone of someone delivering information they found almost too good to be true. "You know who that is?" "I've heard the name." "The guy is, nobody knows exactly what he is, but the rumors are—" Frank glanced around reflexively, dropping his voice. "Governments watch this guy, actively watch him." Damien drank his bourbon. "Good for her." Frank looked at him with the unsubtle fascination of a man watching someone try to stay steady on moving ground. "She's being recognized tonight. Achievement Award or something. The host mentioned it in the pre-event materials." "Frank," Damien said, "can I get you another drink?" Frank, recognizing the social signal, took the offer and moved on. Damien stood at the bar and finished his bourbon and set the glass down with a precise, controlled motion. "She's being recognized tonight." He ordered another drink. Oh. The room changed at 9:17. Damien felt it before he understood it. A shift in the ambient noise, the particular ripple that moves through a crowd when something outside the room demands attention and the information hasn't fully transmitted yet. Conversations stuttered, heads turned toward the main entrance. The jazz quartet in the corner continued playing for approximately 4 more bars before they too seemed to register something and let the music soften almost involuntarily. Damien turned. Through the open doors of the ballroom, he could see the hotel entrance, 2 floors below, through the interior atrium windows. Black armored vehicles. 3 of them, pulling up with the practiced precision of a motorcade. Men in dark suits deployed efficiently from the lead vehicle before the rear doors opened. Not rushing, not performing urgency, just moving with the specific calibrated attention of people whose job was to ensure that the principal's entrance into any space was controlled, clear, and without variable. The ballroom had gone from low roar to murmur to something approaching silence in under 90 seconds. Lucien Moretti entered the room first. Damien had looked him up after Frank's comment, in the way you look someone up when you need to tell yourself you're not threatened by doing so. The photographs he'd found were mostly distant, taken at events where Moretti had clearly not consented to the photograph, and the photographer had clearly understood the risk of trying for a second one. What they conveyed, the height, the stillness, the particular quality of someone who occupied space differently than the people around him, those things translated even in bad photographs. In person, they translated completely. The man who walked into the ballroom carried with him the specific gravitational field of someone for whom violence was a known quantity. Not something he displayed or threatened, but something he'd clearly been in close enough proximity to that it had become simply one of several tools he was capable of using if the situation required, like knowing a language you rarely needed to speak. His charcoal suit was perfect. Dark tattoos climbed from his collar along the left side of his neck and disappeared beneath the lapel, and the hand he held at his side, relaxed, unhurried, showed more ink at the knuckle. He scanned the room once, a single complete arc, and Damien had the uncomfortable certainty that in that single pass the man had catalogued every exit, every potential problem, and every person worth noting. Then he stepped aside and she walked in. Damien's bourbon glass was halfway to his mouth. It stayed there. Seraphina moved through the ballroom entrance in liquid obsidian silk that caught the chandelier light with each step, and the dress was exceptional, but the dress was not the point. The point was the way she moved inside it, the absolute bedrock certainty of a person who had completely stopped wondering how they were being perceived. He'd known her for 7 years, and he had never once seen her walk into a room like that. He had never once seen that specific quality in her spine, that particular angle of her chin, that expression. Not cold, not warm, just present in a way that made every other face in the room look slightly unfinished by comparison. She was 41, and she was the most devastating thing he'd ever seen, and the most devastating part was that she was devastatingly herself in a way she'd never been while she was his wife, and some part of his brain registered this as a data point about causality before he was ready for the data point. The room erupted in whispers like a starting gun had been fired. He heard fragments around him. That's Moretti, the Seraphina Vale. She owns the Imperial Crescent. She owns this hotel. That last one hit him in a specific way. He looked around the room he was standing in. The chandeliers, the marble, the gold-soaked ballroom he'd been drinking bourbon in for the last 90 minutes, and did the arithmetic. She owned the building. She owned the building they were all standing in, the building the Alumni Association had chosen for their annual gala, the building Damien Cross had walked into 40 minutes ago, believing himself to be, if not a main character, at least a plausible supporting one. He set his bourbon glass down on the bar behind him. Across the room, Seraphina had begun moving through the space with Lucien's hand at the small of her back. Not possessive, not performative, just present in the way of someone who'd stopped needing to announce what they were and simply was it. And people were parting for them the way water parts, not from fear exactly, but from the instinctive recognition that something significant was moving through the space, and it was simply easier to not be in the way. She hadn't looked at him. Of course she hadn't looked at him. The room was full of people who'd known her, who'd likely treated her exactly the way he had, as background, as useful but not central, as someone whose primary function was to make others feel more important. There were 240 people in this ballroom, and he was one of them, and she was the reason they were all here whether they knew it or not, and she didn't need to locate him in particular. But he located her. He couldn't stop. He watched her move through conversation. A few words here, a brief exchange there, nothing that looked like effort, and watched the way Lucien moved with her, not in front of her or behind her, but beside her with an attentiveness that was almost architectural, the way a well-designed building supports the thing inside it without calling attention to itself. Frank reappeared at his shoulder. "Told you," Frank said quietly. Damien said nothing. "She looks—" Frank started. "Frank," Damien said, stop talking." Frank stopped talking. He'd had 2 more drinks by the time the gala host took the stage. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't a man who got drunk. He was a man who got very carefully controlled and extremely precise about his movements. But he was operating at the particular pitch that comes from forced composure held too long, the internal equivalent of white-knuckling a steering wheel through a turn you should have slowed down for. The screen behind the stage lit up. Images came in sequence, properties he recognized from financial coverage, from business profiles, from the specific architecture of success built so completely and visibly that it had become its own kind of landscape. Dubai, Singapore. A resort complex in the Maldives he'd read about in a magazine on a flight 3 months ago, had read about without making the connection, without registering the name at the bottom of the article. Her name, all of it, her name on everything. The host's voice filled the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Seraphina Moretti." She rose from her table with the contained grace of someone who'd stopped being surprised by rooms standing for her and walked to the stage, and at the base of the stairs Lucien was there, not following her up, just present at the edge of it, one hand briefly at her back as she took the first step, and then he stepped back and stood still and watched her go up with an expression Damien could read from across the room, because it was the expression of a man looking at something he considered to be the single most important fact of his life. Damien had never looked at her that way. He understood, in the specific and devastating clarity of hindsight delivered too late to be useful, that this was not a coincidence. This was a consequence. This was the direct and measurable result of a decade of choices made by a man who'd needed to feel taller and had spent those years standing next to someone extraordinary and spending the height. She stood at the microphone and looked out at the room with those calm, dark eyes, and when she started to speak, the whole ballroom went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the person speaking doesn't need to ask for silence because the silence simply arrives. "When I was younger," she said, "I believed love meant becoming smaller, so someone else could feel larger." Damien's hands, at his sides, were very still. "I spent years apologizing for my ambition, my intelligence, my voice." He was looking at the floor now. He couldn't not look at the floor. "I thought if I worked harder at being easier to love, eventually someone would choose me fully." She paused. He looked up without meaning to. Her eyes had moved across the room in a slow, deliberate sweep, and when they landed on him, not a pointed stare, not a performance of recognition, just a brief, level, completely unsentimentalized acknowledgement. He felt it the way you feel cold water, total and immediate. "They never do," she said. The air in the ballroom was so tight it felt structural. Because the right people never ask you to become less. A woman 2 tables from Damien put her hand over her mouth. Seraphina's expression didn't shift. No performance of emotion, no playing to the room, just the flat, accurate delivery of a person who'd processed something all the way through and come out the other side of it. "The most dangerous thing a woman can do," she said, "is finally see herself clearly. Because after that, no one can convince her to settle for crumbs ever again." The room came to its feet. Damien did not stand. He sat at his table with his bourbon and watched 238 people give a standing ovation to the woman he'd once told was easier to love when she needed him. And at the base of the stage stairs, Lucien Moretti extended one hand toward her as she descended, and she took it without hesitation, without looking, the automatic reach of 2 people who'd stopped needing to think about each other because they'd moved past thought into something more structural than that. Lucien raised her hand and pressed his mouth to it. Slowly, completely. Like a man who understood exactly what he was doing and wanted every person in the room to understand it also. The room lost its mind. Damien's chair scraped back. He walked to the ballroom's edge, found a corridor, found a window overlooking Chicago's skyline, blazing cold and vast below, and stood there with one hand on the glass and the specific feeling of a man who has spent a significant portion of his adult life building a story about himself and has just watched the most important witness to that story walk across a stage in a building she owned and dismantle the whole narrative in 4 sentences. He stood at the window for a long time. When he turned around, Claire was behind him with her coat on her arm and a careful expression on her face. "Are you ready to go?" she asked. He looked at her, lovely and uncomplicated, and looking at him with the patience of someone who'd learned not to ask certain questions. "Not yet," he said. She nodded and went back to the table without pressing it, and Damien turned back to the window, and somewhere in the room behind him the jazz quartet had resumed and the evening was continuing, and Seraphina Vale Moretti was somewhere in it being exactly who she was with complete disregard for what that cost him. He thought about leaving. He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about things that made him feel small, methodically, looking for the angle that restored his sense of proportion. He didn't find one. He was going to go over there. He understood that now. Not because it was strategic or wise or served any purpose he could articulate cleanly. He was going to cross that room and speak to her because the alternative was leaving without having done it. And leaving without having done it meant carrying this particular weight for the rest of his life without ever knowing if the weight could have been set down. He'd been carrying things for a long time. He straightened his jacket. He finished the last of his bourbon. He turned away from the Chicago skyline and started moving toward the far side of the ballroom where the window seats overlooked the city from a different angle, where he'd last seen her standing with Lucien's hand at her waist and a small smile he'd never once managed to produce in 7 years of trying. And he didn't see, from where he was, the way Lucien's eyes tracked him the full length of the ballroom from the moment he turned around. Didn't see the almost imperceptible tilt of Lucien's chin toward his security lead. The slight adjustment of position that was not defensive and not aggressive, and communicated both possibilities simultaneously to anyone who understood the language. Damien Cross was walking toward a conversation he thought he'd prepared for. He had not prepared for. He had not prepared for Lucien Moretti to already be watching him. Damien understood this the moment he crossed the midpoint of the ballroom floor, and the geometry of the room resolved into something clearer. Moretti was standing near the window seats with one hand in his jacket pocket and a glass of water. Not bourbon, not wine, water, which somehow communicated more about the man than any of the rumors Frank had relayed earlier. And he was talking to a woman Damien didn't recognize, nodding at appropriate intervals, doing everything that constituted polite social engagement while simultaneously tracking Damien's approach with the peripheral attention of someone for whom divided focus was simply the baseline state of being alive. He didn't look at Damien directly. That was the thing. He just knew where Damien was in the room the way you know where a draft is coming from without having to turn and look at the window. Seraphina was 6 feet to Moretti's left, speaking with the gala host, and a woman in a red dress who was leaning in with the particular body language of someone who wanted proximity to significance. Seraphina was listening with her head tilted slightly, one hand holding a glass of sparkling water, the other relaxed at her side. She looked precisely as composed as she had on stage, which was to say completely, which was to say in a way that had nothing to do with effort. Damien stopped 4 feet away. He'd planned to wait for a natural break in the conversation. He stood there for 8 seconds and understood that the natural break was not coming because Seraphina had registered him in her peripheral vision the moment he'd stopped moving and had made a decision about the timing that was not going to change because he was standing nearby wanting it to. He said her name, Seraphina. The gala host turned first, then the woman in red, then Seraphina with the specific unhurried quality of someone who'd decided how this was going to go before it started. She looked at him, direct, level, with those dark eyes that had spent 5 years looking at him across a kitchen table and a marriage bed and 1,000 ordinary and terrible moments, and that now regarded him with the specific detachment of a woman examining something she'd once found significant and had since correctly recategorized. "Damien," she said. Not surprised, not cold, just accurate. Just his name said in the way you say the name of a person who exists in fact, but no longer in any register that matters to you. The gala host, reading the room with professional competence, said something about getting a drink and moved himself and the woman in red away with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd managed social situations for 20 years and recognized an exit cue when the room produced one. They were as alone as two people can be in a ballroom of 240. "You look well," Damien said. He heard himself say it and recognized it immediately as the wrong opening, the social reflex of a man reaching for neutral ground when neutral ground was not what he'd crossed the room for. Seraphina's expression didn't shift. "Thank you. The speech was—" he started. "I'm not interested in your review of the speech," she said. "Not unkind, not angry, just precise, the way a surgeon is precise, cutting exactly where needed and nowhere else." Damien exhaled through his nose. He looked at her for a moment. "Okay. Okay," she said. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "I was cruel to you," he said. "Not because you weren't enough, because you terrified me." Something moved in her face, very small, the way a flag moves in a wind that's almost not there. She studied him the way she studied balance sheets, looking for the thing beneath the presented number, the liability that wasn't in the headline figure. "I know," she said softly. He swallowed. "Do you hate me?" Her eyes moved, not a glance, a deliberate shift, toward Lucien, who was standing with his back now mostly to them, speaking to his security lead in a low exchange that looked entirely routine and almost certainly wasn't. Lucien held Celeste against his left shoulder, the baby's dark-haired head resting below his jaw with the absolute boneless trust of a sleeping child, and his right hand moved in a small, absent circle against her back, the automatic motion of a man so practiced in the habit of her that he didn't know he was doing it. Seraphina watched them for 2 seconds. Then she smiled. Small, genuine, not for Damien's benefit. "No," she said, "I outgrew you." Damien nodded once. He waited to feel something that would constitute a response, anger or relief, or the particular retroactive justification he'd been building in himself for years. He waited, and what came instead was quieter and worse than any of those, a flat, irrefutable recognition of the precise nature of his own role in everything that had happened, arriving not as revelation, but as a thing he'd always known and had simply, successfully, not looked at directly until now. "That's fair," he said. It was all he had. She nodded. She turned slightly back toward the room, which was the end of the conversation communicated without a word. And Damien Cross walked away from the window seats and through the gold-lit ballroom and out into the corridor and then to the elevator and then downstairs and out through the limestone lobby of the Imperial Crescent Hotel, which belonged to his ex-wife, and into the Chicago night. Claire caught up with him at the car. She didn't ask questions. She was good at that. He got in and sat with his hands in his lap and looked out the window at the city going past and said nothing for 23 blocks. It was over. Not the way things end in the movies, not with catharsis or release or any shape of resolution that felt earned. It ended the way most things actually end, which is simply by running out of remaining road. The last of the distance between where you'd been and where you were finally covered, and nothing left to do but sit with the view from where you'd arrived. He'd thought going over there would make the weight lighter. It had made it more precisely located, which was different and in some ways worse, but was at least the truth of what it was. Claire put her hand on his in the dark of the car. He didn't move away. He sat there with Chicago sliding past and thought about nothing in particular for a long time. The Imperial Crescent's private elevator required a key card for the penthouse level. Seraphina had the card in her clutch, the same clutch that held her phone, 3 business cards she'd collected during the evening, and a folded note from Celeste's nanny confirming bedtime had gone smoothly, written in the large looping handwriting of someone who'd been instructed to write legibly. The elevator opened into a private corridor. Lucien's security lead, whose name was Eric and who had been with Lucien for 11 years, and who Seraphina had initially assessed as threatening and later recategorized as the most quietly competent professional she'd encountered outside her own organization, was already there when the doors opened. He nodded once. She nodded back in the specific shorthand they'd developed over 3 years of proximity. "Clear," he said. "Thank you, Eric," she said. He stepped back. She moved down the corridor toward the suite. Lucien was 2 steps behind her with Celeste still against his shoulder, the baby producing the specific small sleep sounds of a person deeply and completely unconscious. He had one hand at the base of Celeste's spine, and his jacket had been removed somewhere between the elevator and the corridor, draped over his other arm. And without it, the tattoos were more visible. The ink climbing his left arm in patterns she'd traced with her fingers enough times that she could have reproduced them from memory. The old scar along his right forearm that he'd told her the true story of only once, and which she'd never asked about again because some things were given once, and that was enough. She opened the suite. Inside, white walls, Chicago blazing through floor-to-ceiling windows, Celeste's travel setup in the second bedroom already arranged by the nanny before she'd left, the quiet of a room at the top of a building at 11:30 at night when the business of the evening was done. Lucien took Celeste to the second bedroom. Seraphina kicked off her shoes at the door. 3-inch heels, obsidian suede, beautiful and punishing in equal measure, and stood in the suite in her gown and stockings and looked out at Chicago for a moment. She heard him come back. She heard the particular sound of him, his walk, the weight distribution of it, the absence of unnecessary sound, and felt him stop somewhere behind her. "How are you?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She turned. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, jacket over a chair now, watching her with the full attention quality that had unnerved her when she'd first encountered it, and that she'd long since understood was simply how he loved, completely, without the usual performative quality of people who needed credit for paying attention. "It's over," she said. "Whatever that was. That chapter. It's done." "It's been done," he said. "I know. Tonight just—" She paused. Confirmed the filing. He said nothing. He waited, which was one of his primary skills and one she'd appreciated from the beginning. The ability to hold silence without filling it, to let things arrive at their own speed. "He looked smaller than I remembered," she said. "I don't mean that cruelly. I'd been carrying this image of him as something significant, something that had weight, and he was just a man in a borrowed tuxedo in a room he didn't belong in, and I felt—" "Nothing?" Lucien said. "Something," she said, "but something small. Like looking at a photograph from a trip and realizing you can't feel the temperature of it anymore." Lucien unfolded his arms. He crossed the room and put his hands on either side of her face with the specific deliberateness of a man who was not going to rush this and was not going to make it into anything other than what it was, which was simply him, here, paying attention. "You're done with it," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said. He kissed her forehead, left his mouth there for a moment. "Good," he said against her skin. She put her hands over his and stood there with Chicago blazing behind her and let herself be still for the first time all evening. And the stillness was not collapse, was not relief exactly, was more like the settling of something that had been slightly out of true for a long time and had finally, at the correct hour, come level. They stood like that for a while. Then her phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. The number was her direct line, the one that 6 people in the world had, and it was 11:47 at night, and the evening had been long in specific ways that had nothing to do with hours. But 6 people had that number, and all 6 of them knew what it meant to use it, so she picked up. Seraphina Vale. The voice on the other end was her COO, Marcus Webb, the same Marcus she'd called at 6:15 on a Thursday morning 9 years ago from her studio apartment with a legal pad and a company that didn't exist yet. He'd been with her since the beginning. He didn't call her direct line at 11:47 unless something was wrong in a way that couldn't wait. "I need you to be somewhere you can talk," he said. His voice was wrong. Not the wrong of a bad quarter or a negotiation that had gone sideways or even the wrong of a deal collapse, which she'd lived through twice and knew the particular frequency of. This was a different wrong, lower, more fundamental. She looked at Lucien. He was already reading her face. "I'm there," she said into the phone. "Talk." A beat. She heard Marcus exhale, the specific exhale of a man who'd been holding something for too long and had run out of time not to release it. "We have a problem with the Hargreave acquisition," he said. Seraphina went still. The Hargreave portfolio, 9 luxury properties across 3 continents, the largest acquisition in Vale Meridian's history, 18 months in development, closed 6 weeks ago. The deal that had been on the cover of Meridian Business Review. The deal that her analyst team had run through due diligence 3 separate times with 3 separate frameworks. The deal she had signed her name to in a room in London with a pen that had been a gift from Lucien and that she'd kept in her desk drawer since. "Define the problem," she said. "The Hargreave title documentation," Marcus said. "The property records for the Monaco and Seoul assets. There are irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that suggests the title chain may not be clean." She sat down on the arm of the suite sofa. She sat with the specific, careful precision of a person who needed to be sitting down and was not going to make a production of needing it. "How far up the chain?" she said. "We don't know yet." A pause. "Sarah, someone forged the verification records. This wasn't a clerical error or a gap in the original documentation. Someone deliberately who found it. External audit team. Routine post-close review. They flagged it this afternoon. I've had our legal team on it for 6 hours. 6 hours." She kept her voice flat. "You had this for 6 hours." "I needed to understand what I was telling you before I told you," Marcus said. "I needed to know how bad it was." "And how bad is it?" The pause this time was long enough that she counted it. 4 seconds. "If the title irregularities go to the root of the chain," Marcus said, "we may not actually own what we paid for." The room was very quiet. She could hear Chicago distantly through the glass. She could hear Lucien moving in her peripheral awareness, not coming closer, just repositioning slightly, present, attentive, reading everything from her half of a conversation he couldn't hear. "The Hargreave Group," she said. "Who was the counterparty lead?" "Richard Hargreave's office. Standard structure. Nothing unusual on its face. The principal was represented through a holding company registered in Luxembourg, which routed through who was the verification attorney." A shorter pause. "A firm called Stanton and Crew. London office." Seraphina knew the name. She knew it because she'd looked at 3 different legal firms for the verification work, and Stanton and Crew had come recommended by an industry contact she trusted, had a clean record, had handled 6 similar closings in the European luxury sector. "I want everything," she said. "Every document, every correspondence. I want the original due diligence files, the verification chain, the communications from Stanton and Crew going back to the first engagement letter. I want it in my secure folder by 4 a.m. "It'll be there," Marcus said. "And Marcus." She kept her voice level. "Who else knows?" "Our legal team, the external auditors, 3 people, all under NDA. That's it." "Keep it there," she said. "Nobody external. Not a word to the banks, not to any of the investment partners, not to—" She stopped. She thought about something. "Marcus," she said slowly. "The industry contact who recommended Stanton and Crew." "Yes?" "Who was it?" Silence. "Pull the email," she said. She heard him moving, keyboard clicks, the particular rhythm of someone going through archived correspondence faster than was comfortable. 30 seconds. Then, "It was Daniel Voss." Seraphina didn't move. Daniel Voss, senior partner at Cross Meridian Advisory Group, a name she'd known for 11 years. A man she'd met at a conference in Hong Kong in year 2 of Vale Meridian, who'd become a reliable industry contact. Not a friend, she didn't keep many of those, but a consistent professional presence, a source of referrals, of market intelligence, of the ambient network maintenance that kept an operation like hers informed about the landscape it operated in. Also, Damien Cross's oldest professional partner, the Cross and Cross Meridian Advisory Group. She sat with this information for exactly as long as it took her to understand its full weight. Then she said, "I need everything you have on Cross Meridian Advisory Group's relationship with the Hargreave Holding Company, tonight." Marcus went quiet in a way that told her he'd already started making the connection. "Sarah." "Tonight, Marcus." "It'll be there," he said. She hung up. Lucien was standing 4 feet away when she looked up. He had the specific stillness of a man who'd been still for a long time and was capable of remaining so indefinitely and was not going to move until she told him what she needed. She told him. She told him clearly and without omission, in the same way she'd always told him things, as a full briefing, not a filtered one, because he'd earned the full version and she'd never found it useful to manage his response to information by curating what he received. She told him about Hargreave, about the title irregularities, about Stanton and crew, about Daniel Voss, about the particular geometry of a connection that might be coincidence and might be the most expensive and precisely targeted act of professional sabotage she'd ever been on the receiving end of. When she finished, the suite was quiet. Lucien's expression hadn't changed. This was either reassuring or terrifying depending on what you knew about what it meant. What it meant, she'd learned, was that he was thinking in a mode that went below expression, the deep processing level where men like him made decisions that were not emotional and were not impulsive, and that tended, when implemented, to resolve problems completely. Daniel Voss, he said. He and Damien have been partners for 8 years, she said. Cross Meridian Advisory Group. Damien is the nominal senior partner, but Voss runs the client relationships and the network. And Voss recommended the firm that may have provided fraudulent verification on the largest acquisition in your company's history. Yes. 6 weeks after close. The timing of when it was discovered, she said. The forgery could have been in place from the beginning. Lucien turned toward the window. He stood with his hands in his pockets looking out at Chicago, and she watched his profile and the specific quality of his stillness and understood that what was happening behind those silver eyes was not rage. Rage was not his register, but something colder and more architectural, the reassembly of a situation into its component parts for the purpose of determining precise and efficient response. How exposed is the company? He said. If the title chain is void, we're looking at potential unwinding of the Monaco and Seoul positions, she said. Combined value. She did the number in her head. Somewhere between 400 and 480 million in assets that may need to be returned or relitigated, plus the reputational exposure if this becomes public before we've controlled the narrative. And your liquidity position? Stable. This doesn't touch the core portfolio, but it changes the growth trajectory for the next 18 months minimum, and it gives the investment partners grounds for... She stopped, pressed her mouth together briefly. It gives people grounds to question the due diligence process, which means it questions the credibility that everything else is built on. Lucien turned from the window. He looked at her with the full, direct, undivided quality that she'd first noticed in Singapore, and that she still found, after 3 years, slightly uncomfortable in the way of something that sees you completely and doesn't look away. Who else would want this, he said. She frowned. What? Beyond Damien Cross, he said. Who else in your competitive landscape has the motive and the access to engineer something like this? She opened her mouth, closed it. She'd been running the Damien Voss connection as the primary hypothesis because the timing of the evening made it feel catastrophically coherent. Damien at the gala, Voss's name in the referral chain, the exquisitely bad timing of an exposure that arrived on the same night she'd accepted a public achievement award in Damien's presence. But Lucien was right to push on the assumption. She was emotionally adjacent to this data point in a way that could compromise her analysis. The Hargreave Group itself, she said slowly, if they sold us assets they didn't fully own and manufactured the verification to close the deal, they're the primary perpetrators regardless of who else is involved. Voss may have been their access point, not Damien's instrument. Or both, Lucien said. Or both, she agreed. What do you need from me? She looked at him steadily. This was the question she'd known was coming and had been thinking about since she'd hung up with Marcus, because it had 2 answers and they were different in ways that mattered. What she needed professionally was her legal team, her analyst team, 20 hours of document review, and the specific kind of focused rage she was capable of converting into productive output when the situation required it. What she might need beyond that, the kind of information that didn't come from document review, the kind that existed in the specific infrastructure of relationships and obligations and pressures that Lucien's world operated through. That was a different question with different implications, and she was not going to ask for it carelessly. I need to know what you know about the Hargreave Holding Company, she said, the Luxembourg entity, not from legal filings, from your network. Lucien's expression shifted slightly. It was the shift she'd learned to read as the boundary between his professional life and hers being acknowledged before it was crossed. If I ask those questions, he said carefully, you understand what asking them costs. Yes, she said. It means certain people know Vale Meridian has a vulnerability. And it means, I understand what it means, she said. I'm asking anyway. He studied her for a long moment. All right, he said. He moved to the suite's second phone, the landline, which she'd never seen him use before, which told her something about what this call was. And she went to the window and stood with Chicago below her and thought about Daniel Voss and Richard Hargreave and the 18 months of work that may have been built on a deliberately rotten foundation and the specific quality of a betrayal so well engineered that it had sat invisible inside her company's greatest achievement for 6 weeks before the first auditor's flag. Behind her, Lucien spoke very quietly into the phone in Italian, then in a language she couldn't identify, and she didn't listen because that was not information she needed, and he would tell her what she needed to know when he knew it. Her phone was already in her hand. She opened the secure folder and the first documents were beginning to populate. Marcus moving fast, which was what she'd needed. She sat down at the suite's desk and opened her laptop. She had until 4 a.m. to understand the full shape of what had been done to her. After 4 a.m., she was going to start figuring out what to do about it. But the documents arrived in tranches. Title records first, the Luxembourg Holding Company's registration chain, the property verification certificates, the signatory pages from Stanton and Crew, then the correspondence between her legal team and the verification firm going back 14 months to the initial engagement. Then the due diligence files themselves, 340 pages she'd reviewed once and her team had reviewed 3 times, and that had produced, at the time, a clean report. She read for an hour. She took notes on a legal pad, yellow, corner drugstore, the same kind she'd been using since year 1. And the notes were not emotional and were not narrative. They were a map, entry points and exit points, and the specific locations where something that should have been solid was instead hollow, where a signature that should have been verifiable was not, where a record chain that should have gone back 30 years went back 11 and then stopped and restarted with a gap that 14 months ago nobody, including her, had caught. At 1:20 a.m., Lucien came and stood behind her. He looked at the screen over her shoulder for a moment. She could feel him reading. The Luxembourg entity, he said quietly. Hargreave Holdings S.A. It was incorporated 11 years ago. Yes, she said. 3 years before the Monaco property was acquired by the Hargreave Group. She turned. She looked at him. The Monaco property was already encumbered, he said, before Hargreave bought it. There was an existing claim against the title from a prior ownership dispute that was never formally resolved. The verification records were manufactured to make the chain look clean. How do you know this already? I made 3 calls, he said. I know the right people in Monaco. She stared at him. The person who manufactured the verification, he said, was not Stanton and Crew acting independently. Stanton and Crew were used. Someone provided them with falsified source documents, and they verified what they were given without going deep enough to find the original encumbrance. Who provided the source documents? Lucien's jaw moved slightly. He set a piece of paper on the desk beside her laptop, a number, handwritten, and a name below it that she didn't recognize. This man, he said, works as a title consultant in Geneva. He's been used 3 times in the last 6 years to manufacture clean documentation for encumbered assets. The previous 2 transactions both routed through the same network of holding companies. She looked at the name. And his client on this transaction? Lucien placed his hand flat on the desk, steady, deliberate. The client instruction, he said, came through a Luxembourg attorney who represents, among other principals, a consortium that includes Cross Meridian Advisory Group. The room was completely still. Seraphina sat with this for a long time. Not because she needed time to understand it, she understood it immediately. The full architecture of it, assembling in her mind with the horrible clarity of something that had been built with precision over a long period of time, specifically to be understood too late. She sat with it because understanding something and accepting the full weight of it are different processes and both required time. Damien Cross had not stumbled into the gala tonight. He had come to watch. He had engineered, or been party to engineering, a transaction that would detonate inside her company's greatest achievement, and he had come to the gala to stand in the room when the fallout began and to look at what was left of the woman he'd once convinced himself was ordinary. That was what it was. She stripped away every other interpretation and looked at the bare structure of it, and that was what remained. She thought about his face at the bar earlier in the evening, his confidence performing for the room. Women like her always realize too late what they lost. She thought about the way he'd looked standing at the window before he'd come to find her. The particular quality of a man waiting for something. Not waiting for the courage to apologize. Waiting to see if the news had broken yet. It hadn't. Not until Marcus's call at 11:47, which meant that whatever Damien had expected tonight had not materialized on his timeline, which meant she stopped. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. "I'm here." "The external auditors," she said. "The 3 people who flagged the irregularities this afternoon. Who commissioned the audit?" A short pause. "It was a routine post-close review, standard procedure." "Who scheduled it?" "It would have been—" She heard him pulling records. "It was scheduled by our compliance coordinator on the standard 60-day post-close calendar." "Who requested the external firm specifically?" Longer pause. "Marcus," she said. "It was a referral," he said slowly, "from Daniel Voss. 8 months ago, when we were still in the Hargreave due diligence phase. He recommended the external audit firm as part of his advisory work, and we kept them on the roster." Seraphina put the phone down on the desk without hanging up. She sat very still. Lucien was watching her. "They commissioned the audit themselves," she said. Her voice was level and completely empty of inflection. "They put the forgery in place, and then they commissioned the external review that would find it. They controlled the discovery timeline." Lucien said nothing. "They wanted it to surface on a specific schedule," she said. "A schedule they could predict, which means they wanted something to happen in a specific window." She stopped. She picked up the phone again. "Marcus, who in the investment partner group has the contractual right to trigger a review of management credibility based on a due diligence failure?" She already knew the answer. She'd written those contracts herself. "The Series B partners," Marcus said quietly. Threshold Clause 14. If a material misrepresentation in due diligence is demonstrated within 90 days of close, who are the Series B partners? Silence. "Marcus, the lead Series B position," he said, "is held by Vantage Capital Partners." "And Vantage Capital Partners," she said, "is managed by Richard Voss," Marcus said, "Daniel Voss's brother." The air left the room. Not dramatically, not with any sound or movement, just the room became smaller and tighter, and the specific quality of a trap, fully understood, settled over everything with the weight of something that had been precisely engineered and was now fully visible in the light, because it no longer needed to be hidden. They had built the acquisition. They had salted it with a flaw. They had commissioned the review that would find the flaw. And the finding would trigger a contractual clause that would give Richard Voss's investment vehicle, already positioned inside Vale Meridian's Series B round, the right to call for a management review. Not a collapse, not a crude destruction, a hostile takeover dressed as a governance mechanism, triggered by a due diligence failure that they themselves had manufactured and discovered on a timeline they controlled. They were not trying to destroy Vale Meridian Holdings. They were trying to take it. She sat at the desk in the penthouse suite of the Imperial Crescent Hotel. Her hotel, the building she owned, the building she'd paid for with 9 years of 100-hour weeks, and a legal pad and a borrowed office, and every resource she'd had. And she looked at the map she'd built on the yellow legal pad, and she understood that she had approximately 72 hours before the contractual trigger window opened, and that when it opened, everything she'd built was on a 72-hour clock that had already been running for 6 hours. She stood up from the desk. The movement was not dramatic. She didn't push the chair back hard or sweep the papers aside or do any of the things that the magnitude of the situation might have licensed. She stood up with the specific controlled economy of a person who has just finished understanding the full weight of a problem and is transitioning from understanding to response. And the transition was clean because she'd made it before. Not at this scale, not with this particular geometry of betrayal, but the fundamental motion of it was familiar. The shift from knowing to moving. The deliberate conversion of a feeling that could have been terror into something operational. Her hands were steady. She noticed this the way you notice your own breathing when you've remembered to pay attention to it. With a kind of detached clinical interest, one part of her mind observing the rest of her with the same data collection quality she brought to external analysis. Steady hands. Good. Lucien, she said. He was already at the desk beside her, looking at the legal pad with the map she'd drawn, reading the structure of it the way he read everything. Completely, without visible reaction, processing at a speed that suggested he was 2 moves ahead of wherever he appeared to be. I see it, he said. 72 hours, she said. The clause requires written notification of intent to invoke before the window opens. After notification, they have 48 hours to formally present the credibility review motion to the full partner group. And if the motion carries? They need 60% of Series B voting weight. Vantage Capital holds 31% of Series B on its own. She picked up the legal pad. The question is who they've already secured in the other 29. Can you block it? I can block it if I get to the other Series B partners before Voss does, but she pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead briefly, then dropped it. But the clause has a disclosure requirement. If I go to the partner group to shore up votes, I have to disclose the due diligence finding, which means the information stops being contained the moment I start making calls. And if you don't make calls? Then Voss walks into the notification window with 31% already in his pocket and the floor in the room. Lucien straightened. He looked at her directly. There's a third option. I know there is, she said. They looked at each other. Tell me what you need, he said again. The same words as earlier in the evening, different weight now. I need the Geneva consultant, she said. The man who manufactured the documents. I need him on record. Lucien's expression shifted slightly. On record how? A sworn affidavit, or its functional equivalent. She held his gaze. The kind that would demonstrate the falsification was external and deliberate, and that Vale Meridian's due diligence process was not negligent, that it was defeated by a sophisticated fraud, not bypassed by an inadequate review. That changes the legal posture. It changes everything, she said. If I can show the partner group that the due diligence failure was not mine, that it was engineered against me, the threshold clause loses its teeth. Clause 14 requires a demonstrable failure of management oversight. If management oversight was deliberately circumvented by the counterparty, the clause doesn't apply. Can you prove that in 72 hours? I can if I have the affidavit, she said. And if I have it, I can also take the whole structure to the partner group as evidence of coordinated fraud against the company, which flips the narrative entirely. This stops being a management credibility review and starts being a criminal matter. Lucien was quiet for 3 seconds. The Geneva consultant, he said carefully, is not going to volunteer that affidavit. No, she said, he's not. Which means someone needs to have a conversation with him. Yes. The kind of conversation, Lucien said, that I'm better equipped to have than your legal team. She held his gaze without flinching. Yes. He nodded once. Then he picked up the paper with the consultant's name and number, the one he'd placed on her desk an hour ago, and looked at it for a moment. I'll need 4 hours, he said. You have 3, she said. I need to be on a call with my legal team at 5 a.m. Chicago time. I need something to show them before that call. Something crossed his face. Brief, almost imperceptible. The specific expression of a man recalibrating a timeline that he would have preferred longer but was not going to argue against. 3 hours, he said. He took the paper, picked up his jacket, and moved toward the suite door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. Don't leave this floor, he said. Not a request, not a command either. Something in between, the register of a man who understood that the woman behind him was not someone who responded well to commands and was asking anyway because the situation required it. Eric is outside? Eric and 2 others, he said. Don't open the door for anyone except Marcus. Lucien, he turned. Be careful, she said. He looked at her with that specific unguarded expression, the one she'd first seen on a Sunday morning in his New York apartment, and that still hit her in a way that had not diminished with familiarity. Always, he said, which was not technically true, but was what he always said, and she'd stopped correcting it. The door closed behind him. She called Marcus at 12:19. "I need you in Chicago," she said. "First flight you can get." "I'm already at the airport," he said. She stopped. "You anticipated—" "I've worked for you for 9 years," he said. "Yes, I anticipated." She let out a breath through her nose. 6 a.m. suite conference room. "I'll be there," he said. "And Sarah? I've been running the partner group numbers while I waited for your call." "Tell me." "Vantage Capital's 31% is confirmed, but the other Series B positions—" She heard him pulling the file. "Meridian Growth Fund holds 18%. They're institutional. They follow process. If the documentation shows fraud rather than negligence, they'll abstain rather than vote with Voss. That gets him below the threshold." "What about Carver Holdings? They hold 11%. "That's the problem," Marcus said. "Tom Carver has been quiet, but his portfolio is underperforming and he's been looking for an exit on his Vail Meridian position for 2 quarters. A management review is an opportunity to force a restructuring that might—" "Tom Carver is in Chicago," Seraphina said. Silence. "He confirmed attendance at the gala tonight," she said. "He was in the room. I saw him." "Did you speak to him?" "No." She was already moving to the window, scanning the city below as though Carver were visible in it somewhere, which was not rational, and she knew it. "But I know where he's staying. He uses the Langham when he's in Chicago. He's been there for 3 years running." "It's past midnight," Marcus said. "Yes," she said. A pause. "Are you going to—" "Get me here at 6 a.m. with everything you have on the title fraud structure," she said. "I need it airtight. Every gap in the chain, every falsified signature, every point at which the external manipulation is demonstrable." "It'll be there," he said. She hung up. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at Chicago's grid of light below, and thought about Tom Carver and his underperforming portfolio and his quiet, opportunistic patience and the 11% he held that would decide whether her company survived the next 72 hours intact or spent the next 18 months in restructuring litigation. Then she called the Langham. Tom Carver answered his room phone at 12:37 in the morning with the voice of a man who'd been awake but hadn't expected the call, which told her he'd been thinking about her company in the dark, which told her Marcus was right about where his head was. "Seraphina," he said. "Tom," she said. "I need 30 minutes. A pause. "It's past midnight. I know what time it is." Another pause, longer. She could hear him deciding. The specific quality of silence on a phone line that is a person doing arithmetic. "Lobby bar," he said. 20 minutes. "I'll be there in 15, she said. She changed out of the gown in 4 minutes. Dark trousers, a charcoal blouse, her hair back. Not the public-facing version of herself, not the gala version, just the working version, which was in some ways the most intimidating of the three because it didn't require anything from its audience. She put on flat shoes because she was going to need to think clearly, and heels were a variable she didn't need. She took the legal pad and a folder of documents she'd already printed from the secure folder. Marcus had been thorough. The material was there. And she picked up her phone and went to the door. Eric was in the corridor, exactly where Lucien had said he'd be. "I need to go to the Langham," she said. Eric looked at her steadily. "Mr. Moretti asked me to keep you—" "Eric," she said. "I have a meeting. I need 2 of your people on the lobby entrance and 1 with me. Can you manage that?" A beat. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. "Let's go." The Langham's lobby bar was the kind of place that stayed open late, with the discreet competence of a hotel that understood its guest schedules were not always conventional. Low light, good leather chairs, a bartender who was not going to make anything of it, when a woman walked in at 12:50 in the morning carrying a legal folder and sat across from a man who looked like he'd been calculating something for several hours. Tom Carver was 61, lean, with the specific, careful energy of a man who'd made a career of waiting for other people to make mistakes and then moving precisely into the space those mistakes created. He had a scotch on the table. He didn't offer to get her anything. She didn't expect him to. She sat down and put the folder on the table and looked at him. "You already know something's wrong," she said. "Not a question." He turned the scotch glass slightly on the table. I heard some chatter this evening. From Voss? His eyes moved. Small tell. From various sources. Voss told you about the title irregularities, she said. He told you about the Clause 14 trigger. And he told you that his brother's fund has 31% of Series B and that if you vote with him, he clears the threshold. Carver was quiet. What did he offer you? She said. He looked at her steadily. A restructured position at a favorable multiple on exit. And what's his timeline for triggering the clause? Notification goes out tomorrow morning, Carver said. She absorbed this. Earlier than she'd calculated, he'd moved the window up, which meant he'd had Carver in conversation before tonight, which meant the gala had not been reconnaissance. It had been the finale of something already in motion. Tom, she said, what I'm about to show you changes the legal character of everything Voss told you tonight. She opened the folder. She laid out the documents in sequence, the title chain, the gap, the Geneva consultant, the falsified certificates, the communication structure that linked the Voss brothers' network to the manufactured fraud. And she walked him through it with the same precision she used in investment committee presentations. Not rushing, not performing urgency, just moving through the structure of it with the clean efficiency of a person who had built her career on making complex information navigable. Carver didn't touch the documents. He read them where they lay, and his expression did not change in any dramatic way. But around the edges of it, something shifted. The recalibration of a man who'd thought he was holding a strong position and was discovering the position had a different shape than he'd been told. When she finished, he sat back. If this is accurate, he said slowly. It's accurate, she said. I'll have a sworn affidavit from the Geneva consultant by 4 a.m. His eyebrows moved, just slightly. How? That's not your concern, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Seraphina, if Voss discovers you're doing this, he's going to discover it, she said. That's the point. I'm not trying to hide it. I'm trying to establish the evidentiary record before he triggers the clause, so that when he does, the clause has no legal foundation to stand on, and the entire structure collapses back on him and his brother and the Hargreave Group. And me? Carver said. If I've been communicating with Voss about this, you've been listening to a pitch, she said flatly. You haven't committed to anything. You're a sophisticated investor who received information from multiple sources and is making a decision based on the most complete picture available. She held his gaze. That's the story. As long as you make the right call in the next 12 hours, that's the only story that needs to exist. Carver looked at the documents for another long moment. Then he picked up his scotch and finished it and set the glass down. What do you need from me? He said. A phone call to Meridian Growth Fund's managing partner at 7 a.m., she said, before Voss's notification lands. You tell him you've reviewed new information regarding the Hargreave acquisition, and you believe the Clause 14 situation requires full legal review before any vote is considered. You don't explain further. You just plant the pause. That gives you the institutional abstention, which keeps Voss below threshold, she said. Yes. He tapped the table once, twice. A man running numbers he'd already run. And the fraud exposure, if this goes to legal proceedings. Vantage Capital's position in Vale Meridian becomes worthless the moment the fraud is established, she said, because their investment was made as part of a coordinated scheme to extract management control from the company they invested in. That's actionable on 4 different statutory grounds. Richard Voss isn't going to want legal proceedings any more than I do. So it settles. It settles, she said, on my terms. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who was revising his assessment of something he'd thought he understood. The Geneva affidavit, he said. 4 a.m. 4 a.m., she said. Then I'll make the call at 7, he said. She picked up the folder. She stood. She looked at him once more with the level, direct quality that had unnerved partners and competitors for a decade. Tom, she said, if you talk to Voss between now and 7, I'll know. And the offer I just made you becomes unavailable. He nodded. I understand. She left him at the table with his empty scotch glass and walked through the Langham's lobby with Eric at her left shoulder, out through the revolving door and into the Chicago night where the air was cold and sharp and tasted like the lake 3 blocks east. and she exhaled once, hard, watching her breath cloud briefly in the dark. 2:53 a.m. Affidavit in 67 minutes. Carver's call in 4 hours and 7 minutes. Voss's notification window opening sometime in the next 12 hours. She was 3 moves deep in a game that her opponent had been building for months, and she was playing it in real time with incomplete information and a clock she hadn't set and which was not going to wait for her to feel ready. She had never felt more awake in her life. The affidavit arrived at 3:58 a.m. She didn't ask how. She told Lucian 3 hours, and he delivered in 2 hours and 58 minutes, and the document that came through the secure channel was legally formatted, witnessed, and bore the signature of a man in Geneva who had clearly been persuaded that cooperation was the significantly better of his available options. She read it twice, forwarded it to her legal team's secure server, and sent Marcus a single message. "It's here. See you at 6. Lucian came back to the suite at 4:12. He looked exactly as composed as he'd looked when he left, which told her nothing and everything simultaneously. She'd learned not to ask for the specifics of how. What mattered was the result, and the result was 3 pages of sworn testimony that unraveled the entire fraud architecture and placed the origin of the falsification precisely and legally outside Vale Meridian's due diligence process. He looked at her when he came in, took her in quickly, the full assessment, the dark circles, the legal pad with 4 hours of notes on it, the 2 empty coffee cups, the flat shoes she'd been walking the suite in since 1 a.m. "Did you sleep?" he said. "I'll sleep in 72 hours, she said. He sat on the edge of the desk. "Carver?" 7 a.m., call to Meridian Growth Fund. He'll hold. She paused. "I think." "You think?" 65-70%, she said. "He's transactional, but the alternative costs him more than the accommodation does. He'll hold." Lucian nodded. He reached across the desk and picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, found it empty, and set it back down with the specific expression of a man filing a note about coffee for later. "What happens when Voss finds out?" he said. "He sends the notification anyway," she said. "He has to. He's already committed the resources. But when the notification arrives and my legal team files the fraud affidavit in response, and Meridian Growth Fund declines to vote pending review, he's looking at a motion that can't clear a threshold and an evidentiary record that points directly at his brother's fund as the primary instrument of a coordinated fraud. He'll counterfile. He'll try, she said, but he's doing it from a defensive position with a paper trail that I now control. The discovery process alone will... Her phone rang. She looked at it. Unknown number, Chicago area code. She picked up. "Vale?" The voice on the other end was not Marcus. It was not Tom Carver. It was not anyone in her organization. It was Daniel Voss. "Seraphina," he said. His voice was measured, the specific calm of a man who believed he was still playing from strength. "I thought we should speak before the morning." She looked at Lucian. He read her face and went very still. "I'm listening," she said. "You've been busy tonight," Voss said. "Tom Carver is a cautious man. I'm not surprised he wanted to hear your version." "He heard facts," she said. "Not a version." A slight pause. "The Geneva matter. That was fast work." "I have good resources," she said. "Yes," he said. "You do." Another pause, longer. "Seraphina, this doesn't have to be adversarial. The Hargreaves situation is unfortunate. Title disputes happen. The resolution pathway that serves everyone is the one where your brother's fund gets 40% of Vale Meridian's board seats, and I spend 18 months defending a management review while you strip the asset base," she said. "No, thank you." Silence. "The affidavit isn't going to hold," he said. The measured quality of his voice had shifted slightly, not cracking, but developing a hairline, the specific stress line of a structure underload it hadn't anticipated. "Why not?" she said. "Because the person who signed it," Voss said carefully, "has a history of providing documentation under duress. A good attorney will establish that in deposition in 48 hours. "Are you threatening my witness?" she said. "I'm describing a legal reality," he said. "Seraphina, I'm trying to offer you a..." "Daniel," she kept her voice completely level. "I'm going to explain something to you once, and I need you to hear it clearly. Silence. You built a very sophisticated structure, she said. The Hargreave transaction, the title fraud, the discovery timeline, the Clause 14 trigger. It's genuinely impressive work. Someone spent a long time on it. You should be proud of the architecture. She let that sit for one beat. But you made one mistake, she said. What mistake? Voss said. And beneath the measured professional surface, she could hear it now. The specific frequency of a man who has been certain of his position for months and is experiencing for the first time the possibility that the certainty was wrong. You did this, she said, to the wrong woman. She hung up. The suite at 5 a.m. had the specific quality of a space that had been worked in through the night. Papers on every surface, 2 laptops open, the particular stale coffee smell of sustained high-stakes concentration. Lucien had ordered food from the hotel kitchen at 4:30, actual food, not the coffee and anxiety diet she'd been running on. And it sat on the side table largely untouched because she'd looked at it, and her body had simply not registered hunger as a current priority. And Lucien had looked at the untouched food, and then at her, and not said anything because he'd been with her long enough to know the hierarchy. She was standing at the window when Marcus knocked at 5:58. Eric let him in. Marcus Webb was 53, gray at the temples, wearing a suit he'd clearly put on in an airport or a car rather than a hotel room, because there was no hotel room, because he'd come straight from the airport because she'd called him at midnight and he'd been there. He came in carrying a laptop bag and 2 cardboard coffee cups from something that had been open at whatever hour he'd arrived, and he set the coffees on the desk and opened his laptop and looked at her with the expression of a man who'd worked for her for 9 years and had never once needed her to tell him what they were here for. Walk me through it, she said. He walked her through it. The complete fraud structure took 40 minutes to map in full. By the end of it, the conference table, a glass-topped thing she'd had brought up from the hotel's business center at 2 a.m., was covered in printed documents arranged in the specific spatial logic she used when she was building a presentation that needed to tell a story, not just report data. When Marcus finished, she stood back and looked at the full map of it. The affidavit plus the internal communication chain, she said. That's our primary submission. It establishes the external origin of the falsification, Marcus said, and the Geneva consultant's testimony specifically names the Luxembourg attorney who received the instruction, which connects to Voss's network directly, she said. Yes. What about the Hargreave group itself? Marcus opened another file. Richard Hargreave's signatures on the verification certificates that we now know are fraudulent. He either signed documents he knew were false or signed documents without adequate review. And either way he's exposed, she said, significantly. She looked at the map. She looked at the clock. 6:43 a.m., Carver's call to Meridian Growth Fund in 17 minutes. Voss's notification window could open at any point from now. Marcus, she said, if Voss sends the notification before Carver makes the call, then we respond with the fraud filing the moment the notification arrives, Marcus said. It still triggers the legal review pause. The procedural outcome is the same. It changes the optics, she said. If his notification lands first, the opening story is management failure. Even if we flip it in the legal filing, the first 24 hours of coverage looks like her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. Check your email. Now. She looked at Lucien. He was already moving toward her. She opened her email on the laptop. The most recent message was from an address she didn't recognize, time-stamped 6:41 a.m., subject line blank. She opened it. 1 attachment, no text in the body. She opened the attachment. It was a photograph, high resolution, clearly taken with professional equipment or a very good phone. The image showed a conference room, modern, clean, clearly a hotel meeting room somewhere. Around a table sat 4 people. She recognized 2 of them immediately. Richard Voss, Daniel Voss. The other 2 she didn't recognize. But in the corner of the photograph, partially obscured by the room's entrance column but identifiable by the particular set of his shoulders, the particular way he stood with one hand in his jacket pocket and the other wrapped around a glass at his side, was Damien Cross. The timestamp embedded in the photograph's metadata read 11:49 p.m. last night. While she had been on the phone with Marcus, while Lucien had been making calls, while Damien Cross had been standing at the window of the Imperial Crescent Ballroom with the empty look of a man carrying something heavy, he had been in this hotel. 2 floors below the suite she was standing in now, in a meeting room with both Voss brothers and 2 men she needed to identify, in a meeting that had started at some point during the gala and had continued past midnight. He hadn't come to watch. He had come to coordinate. She stood very still with the laptop in her hands and the photograph on the screen and the full revised structure of what she was looking at assembling itself with the horrible precision of a puzzle whose final piece has just appeared and whose image, now complete, is worse than any of the partial versions had suggested. Damien Cross had not been a passive beneficiary of Voss's scheme. He was not a distant partner in an advisory firm whose associate had planted a referral and stepped back. He had been in this hotel last night, in a meeting with the men who were trying to take her company, while wearing the face of a man coming to apologize and making her believe, for the duration of one window-side conversation, that he had come with nothing but regret. The phone in her hand buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time a call, not a message. She answered. The voice was a woman's, clipped, professional, zero preamble. Ms. Vale. My name is not important. What's important is that I've been inside the Voss operation for 14 months and I have 47 minutes before the notification goes out, and after that I can't protect this information or myself. Seraphina's grip on the phone tightened. Who are you? She said. Someone who made the wrong call when I took this job, the woman said, and has been waiting for the right moment to make a better one. I have the full communication record. Every email, every instruction, every transfer record between Voss Capital, the Hargreave Group, and Cross Meridian Advisory. I have the original instruction to the Geneva consultant and the fee transfer that preceded it, and the internal memo that explains exactly why they chose your Hargreave acquisition as the target. The room was completely silent. Why, Seraphina said very quietly, did they choose it? A short pause. Because Damien Cross told them you'd never see it coming, the woman said. He told them you had one vulnerability. That when it came to anything connected to him, you'd feel it before you'd analyze it. That the personal exposure would slow your response by 24 hours minimum. Another pause. He was wrong about that, by the way. I've been watching the timestamps on your secure folder activity tonight. Seraphina stood very still. He was wrong, the woman said again, softer. Lucien was 2 feet away. She couldn't look at him. She was staring at the window in the Chicago morning beginning to gray at the edges of the skyline, and she was holding herself with the specific, rigid composure of a person who is not going to let the full weight of something land until they have finished doing what needs to be done, and then they will find somewhere private and let it send me everything, Seraphina said. Right now. Whatever secure channel you have, use it. Send it to... She gave the address. You have 47 minutes. 46, the woman said. Then stop talking to me and start sending, Seraphina said. The line went dead. She looked at Lucien. He was looking back at her with those gray eyes and the full unguarded expression, and she knew he'd heard enough of it, understood enough of the shape. He was in the building, she said. Her voice was level, completely level. Last night, 2 floors below us. Lucien said nothing. He told them I'd hesitate, she said. He told them that anything connected to him would slow me down. Still nothing from Lucien. Just those eyes, just that complete, unwavering attention. He doesn't know me anymore, she said. Something moved in Lucien's face. Brief, fierce, gone in under a second. No, he said. He doesn't. Her phone began to receive. Document after document after document, coming through the secure channel in rapid succession, 47 minutes of a countdown compressing themselves into the specific urgency of a whistleblower who had made a decision and was executing it before the window closed and the cost of the decision became permanent. Marcus was already at the laptop, pulling the documents as they arrived, scanning the structure of them with the speed of a man who'd spent 9 years reading complex financial architecture at volume. Sarah, he said after 90 seconds. She looked at him. This is everything, he said. This is all of it. She looked at the document count accumulating on the screen. 40, 60, 83. Then she looked at the clock. 6:52 a.m. 8 minutes until Carver's call. 39 minutes until Voss's notification window. She picked up the legal pad. She uncapped the pen. She looked at the map spread across the conference table, the whole structure of what had been done to her and what she was about to do about it. And she felt, in her chest, the specific cold weight of a woman who has run out of all the room she'd been giving people and is now out of patience entirely. She wrote one line on the legal pad, not a strategy note, not a number or a framework or a procedural sequence. One line, in the plain declarative style she'd used since the first legal pad in the studio apartment 9 years ago when she'd sat down and written a business plan for a company that didn't exist yet in a room that smelled like someone else's cleaning products. The line read, "End this today." She set the pen down. She looked at Marcus. "How long to compile the full submission package?" she said. "Fraud affidavit, Geneva testimony, the whistleblower documents, the communication chain, everything formatted for legal filing." Marcus looked at his screen. His hands were already moving. 90 minutes if I have help." "You have help." She looked at Eric in the doorway. "Eric, I need Lucien's attorney, the one in New York. I need him on a call in 20 minutes. Eric nodded and stepped into the corridor. She looked at Lucien. "Your attorney has jurisdiction over the Luxembourg entity?" "He has relationships that cover it," Lucien said. "What do you need?" "I need a filing initiated in Luxembourg that freezes the Hargreave Holdings SA assets pending fraud investigation," she said. "Simultaneously with the domestic filing. If Voss or the Hargreave Group tries to move assets out of the holding company when they realize what's happening, it won't be possible," Lucien said. "Can he do it in the window?" "He's done faster things in shorter windows," Lucien said. She nodded. She turned back to the conference table. 6:58 a.m. 2 minutes until Carver's call to Meridian Growth Fund. 33 minutes until Voss's notification window. "Marcus," she said. "The 2 men in the photograph with the Voss brothers and Cross. I need them identified." "Already running it," he said without looking up. "Give me 10 minutes. "You have 5, she said. She picked up her phone and called her lead litigation attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who billed at rates that made junior associates physically uncomfortable and who Seraphina had retained 4 years ago, specifically because she was the kind of attorney who answered her phone at 7 a.m. on the morning after a Chicago gala without asking why. Patricia answered on the second ring. "I've been expecting your call since midnight," Patricia said. "Marcus briefed me on the title situation at 1 a.m. I've had 2 associates working the clause 14 language since 2. "The whistleblower documents just came in," Seraphina said. 83 files. They establish full external origination of the fraud and direct connection to Voss Capital and Cross Meridian Advisory Group. I need the complete submission package ready to file in federal court by 9 a.m. Chicago time. A short pause. "That's tight." "I know. But doable," Patricia said. "What's the primary cause of action?" "Securities fraud, wire fraud, and tortious interference," Seraphina said. "And Patricia, I want a parallel filing with the relevant financial regulatory authority, not as leverage, as record. You want this to be a matter of public regulatory record." "I want there to be no version of events," Seraphina said, "in which this gets settled quietly in a back room and disappears. I want the structure of what was done to be visible." A beat. Then, "All right," Patricia said. "Send me the whistleblower files now. I'll have the draft ready for your review by 8:15. She forwarded the files. She put the phone down. 7:01 a.m. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tom Carver. 2 words. "Call made." She showed it to Lucien without comment. He read it and nodded once. Meridian Growth Fund was now on pause. Voss's threshold was unreachable even if he triggered today. The Clause 14 mechanism, the whole architecture of a hostile takeover dressed as governance, had just lost its functional core. He didn't know that yet. She let him not know it for 28 more minutes. At 7:29 a.m., Daniel Voss's notification arrived in Vail Meridian Holdings' official corporate inbox, routed through the Series B communication protocol as required by the partnership agreement, formal and procedurally correct, and carrying the weight of months of careful planning. Seraphina read it standing at the conference table with Marcus beside her. It was 3 pages. Clean professional language. Invoked Clause 14. Cited the title irregularities in the Hargreave acquisition as grounds for a management credibility review. Requested a formal partner group meeting within the 48-hour window as specified in the agreement. Signed by Richard Voss as managing partner of Vantage Capital Partners. She read it twice. Then she handed it to Marcus and said, "File." Patricia Osei filed the federal complaint at 7:46 a.m., 13 minutes after the Voss notification arrived, and 7 minutes before the earliest moment at which Daniel Voss could have expected any response at all. The complaint was 112 pages. It named Vantage Capital Partners, Cross Meridian Advisory Group, Hargreave Holdings S.A., and 4 individuals including both Voss brothers and the Geneva consultant as defendants. It attached the full whistleblower document package as exhibits and included the sworn affidavit obtained in the pre-dawn hours by methods that the filing described accurately as independent investigation. The Luxembourg asset freeze, initiated through Lucien's attorney simultaneously, locked the Hargreave Holdings SA structure at 7:51 a.m. Central European Time, which was 12:51 a.m. in Geneva, which was the middle of the night for the Geneva consultant who had signed the affidavit several hours earlier and who would not learn about the freeze until morning and would spend the subsequent 48 hours being very cooperative with investigators for reasons having nothing to do with Lucien Moretti and everything to do with the specific arithmetic of a man assessing his options. By 8 a.m., Patricia Osei had sent courtesy copies of the federal complaint to the attorneys of record for each named defendant. At 8:07, Daniel Voss called Seraphina's direct line. She let it ring. At 8:09, he called Marcus. Marcus, following instructions she'd given at 7:15, answered and said, "Ms. Vale has referred all communications regarding this matter to counsel. Please contact Patricia Osei at," and gave the number and hung up. At 8:12, Richard Voss called Tom Carver. Carver, to his credit, did not answer. At 8:23, Seraphina's phone showed a call from a number she recognized after a moment as the main line for Cross Meridian Advisory Group. She looked at it ringing in her hand. Lucien was watching her from across the room. She answered. "Damien," she said. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds, long enough to tell her everything about what the last 40 minutes had looked like from his side of it. "You moved fast," he said. His voice was not what she'd expected. Not aggressive, not defensive in the way of a man reaching for position, just compressed. The voice of a man for whom something has just collapsed and who has not yet found the language for the size of what's fallen. "I always move fast," she said. "You knew that." Another silence. "The woman who sent you the documents," he said. "I need to know—" "You don't need anything from me," she said. "Your attorney will be receiving correspondence from Patricia Osei within the hour. Everything you need to know is in that filing." "Seraphina." His voice broke on the second syllable. Not dramatically, just went soft in the place where the consonant should have been sharp. "I need you to understand that when I got involved with this, I didn't—" "Damien," she said. He stopped. "Don't," she said. "Whatever you were about to tell me about what you understood or intended or believed you were doing, don't. Not because I don't think you've convinced yourself it's true, but because it doesn't matter. What matters is what you did. And what you did is in the filing." She could hear him breathing. "I told them you had a weakness," he said very quietly. "I told them you'd hesitate if the thing connected to me, that you'd feel it before you'd analyze it." A pause. "I was wrong." "Yes," she said. "You were. I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought watching you become what you became meant I was owed something. I know how that sounds. I know it's—" Another stop. "I know." She stood at the window of the penthouse suite with Chicago fully lit below her now, the morning complete, the lake glinting 3 miles east with the cold, flat silver of early winter light. She stood there and she listened to the sound of Damien Cross on the other end of the line, finally running out of the story he'd been telling about himself, and she felt for him something she hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness. She wasn't there. Maybe she'd get there eventually. Maybe not. Not contempt, which had been the available feeling for the last 6 hours, and which she'd used as fuel and which had burned clean. What she felt was something closer to the specific sadness of looking at wreckage and understanding exactly how it happened. Not excusing it, not absorbing it, just seeing the chain of choices that produced it with clear eyes and recognizing that the chain had started somewhere real, with a real person who'd had real capabilities and had spent them on the wrong things for the wrong reasons until there was nothing left but the need to take from someone who'd done it better. "Get a good attorney," she said. "Not because I'm asking you to make this easy, because the filing is comprehensive and you're going to need one." She hung up. She set the phone on the windowsill. She stood there for a long moment with her hand on the glass and the city below her and the morning all the way open. Then she picked up the phone, turned around, and went back to work. The next 72 hours did not feel like victory. That was the first thing she would tell Marcus later, in the specific debrief that happened 3 weeks after, when the immediate crisis had resolved into the slower machinery of legal process and regulatory review and the particular administrative weight of a situation that was won but not finished. Victory had a shape she'd felt before. The closing of the Seoul deal in the back of an armored car at 1:15 in the morning, the day the Monaco acquisition cleared final approval, the morning she'd opened the Meridian Business Review profile and read herself described as formidable. Those had a specific quality, a temperature. The 72 hours after the filing felt different, colder, more like the aftermath of a long illness. Not recovery exactly, more the exhausted clarity that comes after the fever has broken and the body is assessing what it cost. Richard Voss's attorney contacted Patricia at 10 a.m. to open settlement discussions. She'd told Patricia to let them talk, say nothing substantive, and report back. By noon, the tone of the discussions had shifted from negotiating leverage to managing exposure, which was the correct direction and which told her the filing had landed the way she'd built it to land. The Hargreave Group's legal team went silent entirely for 18 hours, which was the legal equivalent of a person who has just realized the size of the hole they're standing in and is very carefully not moving. When they resurfaced, they came with a preliminary offer that was inadequate on 3 grounds, and that Patricia rejected in a letter that was 2 paragraphs long and did not waste words. The Meridian Growth Fund's managing partner called Marcus at 2 p.m. to say formally that they were deferring any consideration of the Clause 14 matter pending full legal review, which was the institutional phrasing for "we are not touching this," which was exactly what she'd needed and which Carver had delivered on schedule. Daniel Voss called Patricia 4 times. Patricia returned none of the calls personally and had an associate send a written response to each that was correct in every procedural respect and communicated nothing the filing hadn't already communicated and cost Voss's team approximately 3 hours of their own attorney's time to decode, which she had not specifically intended but did not find distressing. At 4 p.m., she finally ate something. Lucien had ordered food at some point in the mid-morning, real food, the kind from a hotel kitchen that knew what it was doing, and it had sat on the side table and she'd looked at it twice without being able to redirect enough attention to actually engage with it, and then at 4 p.m. something in her body registered the absence of input in a way that crossed from background noise to actual signal, and she sat down and ate for the first time in approximately 16 hours and felt, in the specific physical way of a person who has been running on caffeine and adrenaline and the biochemical output of crisis, like the floor had come up to meet her. Celeste woke up from her afternoon nap at 4:30 and was brought in by the nanny with the imperious, well-rested energy of a 1-year-old who had not been informed that the world had been on fire for the previous 17 hours and considered the current level of available adult attention to be personally insufficient. Seraphina sat on the sweet sofa and held her daughter against her chest and felt the specific weight of her. The warm, animal solidity of a small person with complete confidence in the safety of where she was, and something in her chest that had been held at a specific tension for 17 hours released slowly, the way a fist opens when the thing it's been holding is finally set down. Celeste grabbed her mother's collar with one determined fist and made a sound that was not quite a word and looked up at her with those gray eyes. Lucien's eyes, exactly, but smaller and softer and with none of the history behind them yet. And Seraphina put her mouth against the top of her daughter's head and breathed in and stayed there. Lucien sat on the arm of the sofa beside them. He put his hand on Seraphina's back, not speaking, just there, the warm, steady weight of him, the specific presence that had been the fixed point of her last 3 years, the way the desk had been the fixed point of the 9 years before that. They stayed like that for a while. The settlement took 11 weeks. Not because it was complicated, the evidentiary record was clean enough that complexity would have cost the defendants more than conceding it, but because there were multiple parties with overlapping and occasionally conflicting exposure, and coordinating their capitulations required the particular patience of watching several people try to exit a burning building through the same door simultaneously. Richard and Daniel Voss agreed to a financial settlement that included full divestiture of Vantage Capital's position in Vale Meridian at a price that reflected the fraud premium, which was to say, not the favorable multiple Richard had promised Tom Carver, but a number significantly lower that reflected what the position was actually worth to a buyer who understood the full picture. They also agreed to a consent decree with the Financial Regulatory Authority that placed both brothers under a 5-year bar from serving as principals in any investment fund subject to the applicable regulatory framework, which was not nothing and which Seraphina had insisted on as a non-negotiable condition over Patricia's advice that it was harder to achieve than the financial terms. Patricia had been correct that it was harder to achieve. Seraphina had achieved it anyway. The Hargreave Group unwound the Monaco and Seoul positions back to Vale Meridian at a clawback price that included damages for the carrying costs of the litigation period, plus a compensatory payment that covered a significant portion of the original acquisition premium. The net effect, when Marcus ran the final accounting, was that Vale Meridian emerged from the Hargreave transaction with a smaller gain than originally projected and with 3 months of management bandwidth absorbed by crisis response, but with the core asset base intact, the fraud publicly attributed to its actual authors, and a regulatory record that established the company's due diligence process as the victim rather than the failure point of the scheme. Cross Meridian Advisory Group, the firm specifically, was not named as a primary defendant in the federal complaint. The complaint named Damien Cross individually as an officer of the firm in connection with his role in facilitating the scheme through the Voss network. His personal liability exposure had been significant enough that his attorney had initiated settlement discussions with Patricia before the federal complaint's first hearing, and the resolution had come quietly, in the way that resolutions come when one party has comprehensive documentation and the other party has no remaining angles. He paid. The amount was not public. The consent agreement included a non-disparagement clause that ran in both directions, which Patricia had included at Seraphina's specific instruction, and which Seraphina would later explain to Marcus simply as, "There's nothing left to say. I'd like the silence to be official." The whistleblower, the woman who had called at 6:52 a.m. with 47 minutes on the clock, turned out to be a compliance officer who had been embedded in Daniel Voss's operation for 14 months. Initially as a hire who believed she was joining a legitimate fund management structure and had discovered incrementally over those 14 months that the structure was not what it had presented itself as. She'd made 3 attempts to raise concerns internally, had been managed out of each attempt with a combination of reassurance and implied threat, and had spent the final 4 months of her tenure documenting everything while waiting for a moment when the documentation would be sufficient and the risk of deploying it would be outweighed by the cost of continuing to hold it. Seraphina met with her once, in a conference room in New York 6 weeks after the settlement. The meeting was professional and not long. She thanked her directly, without qualification or excess. She did not offer the woman a position at Vale Meridian because the woman had not asked for one, and because the specific transactional nature of what the woman had done, courageous, yes, but transactional, the compliance officer's own words, did not require reward so much as it required acknowledgement, which was different. At the end of the meeting, the compliance officer said, "For what it's worth, when I was watching the documents come through that night, watching your team respond in real time, I've worked in finance for 16 years. I've never seen anyone move like that under that kind of pressure." Seraphina looked at her for a moment. "I had good preparation," she said. The compliance officer waited as though expecting elaboration. A long time ago, Seraphina said, someone told me I was easier to love when I needed them. And I spent a long time trying to figure out whether that was about me or about them. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. By the time they tried to use it against me, I'd figured it out. She shook the compliance officer's hand and left. It was a Sunday in January when the real settling happened. Not the legal settling, that had its own timeline and its own closure, clean in the specific way of things that are resolved rather than healed. The other kind. The apartment was theirs in Manhattan now, a different one from the penthouse where she'd stood at 2 in the morning with stale cereal and divorce papers. Different floor, different building, different life built by different hands than the ones she'd had then. Larger, because there was Celeste now, and the specific spatial requirements of a 1-year-old who had strong opinions about the geography of every room she occupied. Quieter in its bones somehow, despite being larger. Morning light came through the east windows and laid itself across hardwood floors in long, pale strips that moved slowly as the hour moved. Seraphina was on the kitchen floor, which was where she'd ended up after Celeste had woken at 6 and made her preferences about the morning's location clear, and which was, frankly, not uncomfortable. The hardwood was warm from the underfloor heating Lucien had installed in October because Chicago had reminded him that she was constitutionally incapable of wearing socks. Celeste had fallen back asleep against her chest around 7, the small dark head heavy and perfectly relaxed in the way of children who trust completely and demonstrate it with their whole body weight. Seraphina sat with one hand on her daughter's back and her own back against the kitchen cabinet and looked at the morning light on the floor and thought about nothing in particular, which was still something she had to practice but which was becoming, incrementally, more natural. She heard Lucien in the other room. The specific sounds of his morning, the particular way he moved through space, the brief low sound of a phone call in Italian that lasted 90 seconds and was clearly professional and clearly resolved because the tone shifted into the 2-word close she'd come to recognize as his version of handled. Then the sound of the coffee maker, which he operated with the same economical precision he brought to everything, and then the familiar rhythm of him moving through the apartment toward the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up at him. He was in black sweatpants and a dark long-sleeve shirt, and his feet were bare on the floor and there was a coffee cup in each hand, and one of his phones tucked against his forearm, and the tattoos were fully visible in the morning light. The pattern she could reproduce from memory, the old scar along the right arm, the dark band on his right hand that she'd never asked about in Singapore, and that he'd told her about himself on a winter morning in Turin, the only time he'd gone back, in the first year of their marriage. He looked at her on the kitchen floor with Celeste asleep against her, and his expression did the thing it did on Sunday mornings. Opened in a way it didn't open in any other context, the specific unguarded quality of a man who has arrived, finally, in the place where he didn't have to manage anything. He set one coffee cup on the floor beside her without bending down completely. Just a controlled drop, a practiced movement, close enough for her to reach. Then he leaned against the opposite cabinet and drank his own coffee and looked at her. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, New York was already awake and running, the ambient constant of a city that didn't pause. But it came through the glass at a remove, like weather in another country. "How are you?" he said. Not the crisis version of the question, which he'd asked 17 times in the 11 weeks of the settlement. The plain version, Sunday morning version. "Good," she said. She meant it. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked at Celeste's sleeping face for a moment with the expression that she had no name for but that she'd catalogued anyway. The way she catalogued everything that mattered, filed in the part of her that was not professional and not analytical, and that had been the last part of her to come back online after the years of being small. And that was, she understood now, the part she would spend the rest of her life protecting first. "The Patricia call is at noon," he said. "I know. Final sign-off on the Voss documents." "I know." "And then it's done," he said. She looked at him. "And then it's done." He looked back at her. The morning light moved on the floor between them. Celeste breathed the slow, deep breath of a person entirely at rest. "What do you want to do after the call?" he said. She thought about it. Not strategically. Not with a list or a framework or a projected outcome. Just what did she want? The simple version of the question, the version she'd spent years not knowing how to answer because she'd been so long in the business of wanting what was possible rather than what was true. Walk somewhere, she said. The park. And then food. Actual food, somewhere warm, no phones. He nodded. I know a place. You always know a place. Yes, he said, with the faint edge of a smile. I do. She leaned her head back against the cabinet and looked at the ceiling and felt the weight of her daughter against her chest and the warmth of the coffee cup she'd wrapped both hands around and the particular quality of a morning that wasn't asking her to be anything other than what she was right now, in this room, on this floor, with this man in the doorway and this child asleep and 11 weeks of aftermath finally behind her. She thought about the legal pad on the desk in the other room, the yellow one, corner drugstore, the latest in the long series stretching back to a studio apartment that smelled like someone else's life, and a company that hadn't existed yet, and a woman who'd stood up in the middle of a night and understood, finally, that she was done kneeling. The pad had one line on it. The last line she'd written before the settlement was finalized. Not a strategy note, not a number, just enough, not exhaustion, not resignation. The other kind. The declarative kind, the kind that meant she had taken stock of everything she'd built and everything she'd survived and everything she'd paid for both, and had found it, taken whole and clear-eyed and without flinching, to be sufficient. More than sufficient. The kind of life that held its weight. She'd built a company from a legal pad in a borrowed office and a level of rage she'd learned to convert into something cleaner than rage. She'd survived a marriage that had tried to make her small and a betrayal that had tried to make her nothing. She'd sat in a penthouse suite in Chicago at 2 a.m. with 72 hours on a clock she hadn't set, and she'd moved through it the way she moved through everything. Completely, without hesitation, without the luxury of falling apart, until falling apart was the only thing left on the agenda. And she was on the kitchen floor on a Sunday morning in January with her daughter's warm weight against her chest, and a cup of coffee, and a man in the doorway who looked at her the way she'd once believed it was naive to expect. Not with the diminished proprietary need of someone who required her to be less so they could be more, but with the specific steady attention of a person who had never once, in all the time she'd known him, asked her to turn down her light. She thought about Damien Cross briefly. Not with anger. The anger had been useful, and she'd used it, and it was gone. Not with sadness either, which had surprised her at the end. She'd expected sadness, the residual kind that comes after the main event. But what came instead was the flat, complete absence of him as a weight. Not forgiveness necessarily. Possibly someday. More accurately, the simple factual recognition that she had carried him, his words, his judgment, the particular damage of his particular kind of smallness for a long time, and that she had set him down, and that the setting down had been so complete that she could no longer feel the shape of what she'd been carrying. That was what she hadn't known to wait for, the not feeling. Not the dramatic release, but the quiet, ordinary morning when you reach for a thing that used to live in your chest and find only the regular temperature of a life that has healed over it. The wound had become a scar. And scars, she thought, looking at the morning light moving on the floor, at her daughter's sleeping face, at the man in the doorway with his coffee and his bare feet and his absolute, unconditional presence in her life. Scars were just the evidence of survived things. They weren't the thing itself. They weren't even the story. Not really. They were just the proof that you had been in it and come through and were still, irreducibly, here. Celeste stirred. Small sound, the half-waking murmur of a person deciding whether consciousness was worth pursuing yet. Her fist, which had been curled against Seraphina's collar, flexed once and then relaxed. Seraphina put her mouth against her daughter's hair. "Hey," she said very softly. "Still here." Celeste subsided back into sleep. Lucien pushed off from the counter and crossed the kitchen and sat down on the floor beside her, without comment, without production, just folding himself down and putting his back against the cabinet and his shoulder against hers and his coffee cup on the floor between them. And they sat like that on the warm hardwood in the Sunday morning light, while the city moved outside the windows, and their daughter breathed between them, and the January sun,
came through the glass, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be done had been done. And what was left was simply this. Simply this. The woman who had once been called forgettable sat in the kitchen she'd bought with the money she'd made from the company she'd built with her own hands from a legal pad and a broken open night and a clarity that had come, finally, from the bottom of the worst version of her life. She was 41 years old. She was not done. She was also, for the first time in as long as she could trace it back, not in a hurry. The morning light moved. The coffee went warm, then cool. Celeste slept. And Seraphina Vale Moretti sat still on the kitchen floor of her own life and let it, unhurried and without apology, simply be.